6 years of silence. 6 years of eating Thanksgiving dinner alone in a cabin that felt more like a coffin. Gideon Ward had buried his heart the same day he buried his wife and 2 sons. He swore he'd never open that door again, not for anyone. But when a desperate mother and 3 starving little girls appeared on his porch at sunset, everything changed. What happened next would either destroy him or save his soul. Stay with me until the very end of this story and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this tale has traveled. The wind came down from the mountains that Thanksgiving Eve, like it had something to prove. It swept across the valley floor, rattling the wooden fence posts and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the hard-packed dirt road that led to nowhere worth going. The sun hung low and swollen on the horizon, bleeding orange and crimson into the pale November sky, as if the heavens themselves were wounded and slowly dying. Gideon Ward stood at his kitchen window, watching the light fade. His hands were wrapped around a tin cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold, but he didn't notice. He rarely noticed much of anything anymore. The days blurred together like watercolors left out in the rain. Shapeless, colorless, meaningless. The cabin was silent. It was always silent now. He remembered a time when this kitchen had been filled with noise. The clatter of dishes, the high-pitched laughter of his boys wrestling on the floor, the soft humming of his wife Sarah as she kneaded bread dough on the counter. He remembered the warmth of it, the chaos of it, the beautiful mess of a life lived fully and loved deeply. But that was before the river, before the flood, before everything he loved was ripped away from him in a single merciless night. Gideon closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. He could still hear the water sometimes, in his dreams. He could still feel the mud sucking at his boots as he ran toward the bank, screaming their names into the darkness. He could still see the lantern light dancing on the swollen current, searching, always searching for something it would never find. 6 years. 6 years since he'd pulled their bodies from the water one by one. His wife. His oldest boy, Thomas, who was 10. His youngest, Samuel, who was only 7 and still afraid of the dark. 6 years since he'd stood in the cemetery on the hill, surrounded by neighbors who didn't know what to say, watching 3 pine boxes disappear into the earth. 6 years since he'd stopped living and started merely existing. The coffee had gone bitter in his cup. Gideon dumped it into the sink and set the tin down with more force than necessary. The sound echoed through the empty cabin like a gunshot, and for a moment he hated the silence even more than usual. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving. He'd stopped celebrating years ago. What was there to be thankful for? The cattle that kept him busy enough to ignore the void in his chest? The roof over his head that sheltered nothing but ghosts and regret? The sunrise that came every morning, whether he wanted it to or not, dragging him into another day he never asked for? No. Thanksgiving was for families, for people who still had something to hold on to. Gideon had nothing. He walked to the fireplace and threw another log onto the dying flames. Sparks danced up the chimney like fireflies fleeing a storm. Outside, the wind howled louder, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote began to sing its lonely song to the fading sun. This was his life now. This was all he had, and he had made peace with it, or at least he had convinced himself that he had. He'd built walls around his heart so thick that nothing could get through. He'd pushed away every neighbor who tried to help, every widow who came calling with casseroles and hopeful smiles, every well-meaning pastor who wanted to talk about God's plan. There was no plan. There was only this, a man, a cabin, and the endless silence of a life that should have ended 6 years ago. Gideon was just reaching for the bottle of whiskey he kept on the mantel, the same bottle he reached for every Thanksgiving Eve, when he heard it. A knock. He froze, his hand suspended in mid-air. The knock came again, tentative but insistent. 3 soft raps against the heavy wooden door. Gideon's jaw tightened. Probably one of the townsfolk, he thought. Someone coming to invite him to their Thanksgiving table, to remind him that the Lord doesn't want you to be alone. To look at him with those pitying eyes he'd grown to despise. He considered ignoring it. He'd done it before. If he stayed quiet long enough, they always went away. But then he heard something else. A voice. Small. frightened, barely audible above the wind. "Mama, I'm cold." Gideon's blood turned to ice. That voice, that tiny, trembling voice, it sounded like Samuel. It sounded like his boy on winter nights, crawling into bed beside him, pressing cold feet against Gideon's legs and giggling when his father pretended to complain. But Samuel was dead. Samuel had been dead for 6 years. This was something else. Someone else. Before he knew what he was doing, Gideon crossed the room in 4 long strides and threw open the door. The wind rushed in, carrying with it the smell of dust and desperation. And there, standing on his porch in the dying light of the setting sun, was a woman. She was young, younger than Sarah had been, maybe 30 or so, with dark hair that had come loose from its braid and hung in tangled ropes around her thin face. Her dress was travel-stained and torn at the hem, and her boots were caked with mud so thick it looked like she'd been walking for days. Maybe weeks. But it wasn't the woman who stole Gideon's breath. It was the 3 small figures huddled around her, clinging to her skirts like sailors clinging to wreckage in a storm. 3 girls. The oldest was maybe 12, with her mother's dark hair and eyes that held a fierce protective fire that seemed far too old for her young face. She stood slightly in front of the others, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, as if she were daring the world to try and hurt her sisters. The middle girl was perhaps 8 or 9, with wide eyes and a smudge of dirt across her freckled nose. She was crying silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. And the youngest, the one whose voice had pierced through the door and straight into Gideon's chest, couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was clutching a rag doll that had seen better days, and her entire body was trembling, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion, Gideon couldn't tell. For a long moment, no one spoke. The woman stared at Gideon with eyes that held equal parts hope and terror. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. She was sunburned, her skin cracked and peeling across her cheeks. She was starving. Gideon could see it in the hollows of her face, in the way her collarbones jutted out beneath the thin fabric of her dress. They were all starving. "Please," she finally whispered, and her voice cracked on the word like dry leather. "Please, we haven't eaten in 3 days. My girls, they need—" Her legs buckled. The oldest girl moved like lightning, catching her mother before she could hit the ground. "Mama," she cried, and there was raw panic in her voice, the kind of panic that comes from seeing the one person you depend on start to fall apart. The youngest girl started to wail, a high, keening sound that cut through the wind and straight into Gideon's heart. She clutched her mother's skirt with tiny, dirt-caked fingers, her rag doll forgotten on the porch. "Mama, Mama, wake up! Please wake up!" Gideon stood frozen in the doorway, his mind screaming at him to step back, to close the door, to protect the fortress of solitude he'd built around himself. These people weren't his responsibility. This wasn't his problem. He'd spent 6 years making sure nothing and no one could ever hurt him again, and the surest way to get hurt was to let people in. "Close the door," the cold voice in his head commanded. "Close it and walk away. You can't save them. You couldn't even save your own family." But then the littlest girl looked up at him. Her eyes were enormous, too big for her small, pinched face. They were the color of a summer sky, blue and clear, and filled with a desperate, aching need that Gideon recognized all too well. He'd seen that look in the mirror every day for 6 years. It was the look of someone who had lost everything and was clinging to the last shred of hope they had left. "Mister," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can you help my mama?" Her chin trembled, and something inside Gideon, something he thought had died a long time ago, shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Get them inside," he heard himself say, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Rough, rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. "Get them inside now." The oldest girl stared at him with those fierce, suspicious eyes. "Why should we trust you?" It was a fair question. Gideon couldn't blame her for asking it. Whatever had driven this family to his doorstep, whatever horrors they'd faced on the road, it had clearly taught this child that not all adults could be trusted, that not every open door led to safety. He looked at her steadily. "Because I'm offering you food, warmth, and a place to sleep." And because right now your mother needs help that you can't give her out here in the cold." The girl hesitated, her jaw tight. "Mara?" the middle sister said softly, tugging at her sleeve. "Mara, please. Ellie's shaking. Mama won't wake up." Something flickered in the older girl's eyes. Fear, exhaustion, the weight of too much responsibility carried on shoulders far too young. She looked at her mother, slumped against her side, and then at her little sisters, huddled together against the biting wind. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay. But if you try anything, I won't." Gideon stepped forward and scooped the unconscious woman into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. And she nearly didn't. She was light as a bird, all bones and desperation. "Follow me." He carried her into the cabin, and the three girls followed close behind, their eyes darting around the space like frightened deer expecting a trap. Gideon laid the woman on the bed in the corner, the bed he hadn't slept in since Sarah died, the bed that still had her quilt folded at the foot, and turned to face the children. They stood in a cluster near the door, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The oldest, Mara, her sister had called her, had her arms wrapped around the younger two, shielding them with her body. Gideon's heart clenched. He'd seen that same protective instinct in Thomas. His oldest boy had always watched over Samuel like a hawk, always making sure his little brother was safe, always stepping between him and any hint of harm. "What are your names?" Gideon asked, keeping his voice low and calm. The middle girl looked at Mara, waiting for permission to speak. When her older sister gave a tiny nod, she said, "I'm June. This is Ellie." She gestured to the littlest one. "And that's our mama, Lydia." "Lydia," Gideon repeated. He glanced at the woman on the bed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "She's not sick. She's just worn out. 3 days without food, you said?" June nodded, and her lower lip began to tremble again. "We ran out of everything. The creek we found was muddy, and Mama said we shouldn't drink it, but Ellie was so thirsty." "We didn't have a choice," Mara cut in, her voice hard, defensive. "We did the best we could." "I'm not judging you," Gideon said quietly. "I'm just trying to understand what you need." He moved toward the kitchen, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "I've got stew. Made it yesterday. It's not much, but it's hot and it's filling. Can you eat?" 3 heads nodded in unison. Gideon ladled stew into 3 bowls and set them on the small table near the fire. The girls hesitated, glancing at each other, at their mother, at the door. "Eat," Gideon said. "I'll watch over her. I promise." Slowly, cautiously, the girls moved toward the table. Ellie was the first to pick up her spoon. She took 1 bite, and her eyes went wide. The look of someone who has forgotten what warm food tastes like. She began to shovel the stew into her mouth so fast that Gideon was afraid she'd choke. "Easy," he said gently. "Slow down, little one. There's more where that came from. No one's going to take it away from you." Ellie looked at him with those enormous blue eyes, and for a moment she seemed to really see him. Not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as something else. Something she needed. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, stew dripping from her chin. Gideon's throat tightened. "You're welcome." He turned away before any of them could see the moisture gathering in his eyes. An hour later, the girls had eaten their fill and were dozing by the fire, wrapped in blankets Gideon had pulled from a trunk he hadn't opened in years. The blankets still smelled faintly of lavender, Sarah's favorite scent, and he'd had to take a moment in the back room to compose himself before bringing them out. Lydia was awake now, propped up against the pillows with a bowl of broth in her hands. She was still pale, still weak, but some color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes were clear. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice still hoarse. "We had nowhere else to go. I saw the smoke from your chimney, and I prayed you wouldn't turn us away." Gideon sat in the chair across from the bed, his hands resting on his knees. "Where were you headed?" Lydia's grip tightened on the bowl. "Anywhere. Anywhere but back." "Back where?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the broth as if it held answers she couldn't speak aloud. Finally she said, "My husband died 4 months ago. Fever took him quick. 1 week he was working the fields, the next—" She swallowed hard. "The next, I was burying him." "I'm sorry," Gideon said, and he meant it more than she could possibly know. Lydia nodded, acknowledging his words without really hearing them. We had a homestead, good land. Nathan, my husband, he'd worked it for years. It was supposed to be ours, supposed to pass to the girls someday. Her voice hardened. But Nathan had a brother, Silas. The name came out like a curse. Silas showed up the day after the funeral with papers, said the land was his, said Nathan had signed it over to him before he died. Lydia's hands were shaking now, making the broth ripple in the bowl. It was a lie. Nathan would never have done that. He knew what kind of man Silas was. He would have died before letting his brother anywhere near this family.
But what kind of man is Silas? Lydia looked up, and the fear in her eyes was answer enough. The kind who takes what he wants, the kind who doesn't care who he hurts, the kind who... She stopped, her voice breaking. He said if I didn't leave quietly, he'd take the girls. Said he'd go to the county judge, a man he plays cards with every Saturday night, and have them declared wards of his household. Said a widow with no land and no money couldn't possibly provide for 3 children. Gideon felt something hot and dangerous rise in his chest. He threatened your children. He did more than threaten. Lydia set the bowl aside with trembling hands. He came to our house one night, drunk. Said things to Mara that no man should ever say to a child. That was when I knew we had to run. She looked at the sleeping girls by the fire, and her face crumpled with a mother's anguish. I packed what I could carry. We left before dawn. We've been walking for almost 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Gideon repeated, stunned. On foot? With 3 children? We had a wagon at first, but the axle broke 3 days ago, and I couldn't fix it, so we walked. Lydia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I kept telling myself we just had to make it to the next town. Just 1 more day, 1 more mile. But then the food ran out, and She shook her head. I started to think maybe we wouldn't make it. Maybe this was how it ended. But you did make it, Gideon said quietly. You're here now. Lydia looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since she'd woken up. Why did you help us? I know what they say about you in town, the rancher who lives alone, the man who turned away from everyone after... She stopped, seeming to realize she'd ventured into territory she shouldn't have. After what? Gideon asked, though he already knew. After you lost your family? Lydia's voice was soft. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have mentioned. It's fine. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, unable to face her. You're right. I did lose them. My wife. My 2 boys. 6 years ago this month. I'm so sorry. People always are. He watched the moon rising over the distant mountains, cold and distant as the years that had passed. The flood took them. The river swelled in the night, and our cabin was too close to the bank. I tried to save them. I tried to... His voice caught. I was too late. The silence stretched between them, filled with shared grief that needed no words. Is that why you helped us? Lydia asked gently. Because you saw something in my girls that reminded you of your own children? Gideon turned to face her. I helped you because you needed help. That's all there is to it. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. When he'd looked at Ellie's trembling chin, when he'd seen Mara step in front of her sisters like a tiny warrior, when June's tears had cut tracks through the dirt on her face, he had seen ghosts. Beautiful, terrible ghosts that he'd spent 6 years trying to forget, and he'd found that he couldn't let them suffer. Not again. The girls slept through the night, deeply, soundly, the way only exhausted children can sleep. Lydia dozed fitfully on the bed, waking every few hours to check on her daughters, to make sure they were still breathing, still safe. Gideon didn't sleep at all. He sat in his chair by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the house, the soft breathing of the children, the occasional murmur as June shifted in her sleep, the creak of the floorboards as the cabin settled around them. It had been so long since there had been sounds in this house, so long since it had felt like anything other than a tomb. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Ellie woke first. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes with small fists, and looked around the cabin with confusion. For a moment, she seemed to have forgotten where she was. Then her gaze found Gideon, and she relaxed.
Good morning, mister, she said, her voice thick with sleep. Good morning, Gideon replied. Gideon's. Did you sleep well? Ellie nodded, then looked down at the blanket wrapped around her. She touched it gently, almost reverently. This smells like flowers. Lavender, Gideon said, and his voice came out rough. It was my wife's favorite. Your wife? Ellie tilted her head, curious. Where is she? Gideon hesitated. He wasn't used to answering questions from children anymore. He wasn't used to questions at all. She's gone, he said finally. She's been gone for a long time. Ellie's small face fell. Oh, like my daddy? Yes, like your daddy. The little girl was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the gravity only children possess. Then she said, Mama says Daddy's in heaven now. She says he's watching us from up there. She pointed toward the ceiling. Do you think your wife is watching you too? Gideon's eyes burned. I don't know, he admitted. I'd like to think so. I bet she is. Ellie smiled, a small, sweet smile that seemed impossibly bright, given everything she'd been through. I bet she's really happy you helped us. Before Gideon could respond, the door burst open. Cold air rushed into the cabin, swirling with dust and the faint smell of horse sweat. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face like a clenched fist. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the sleeping children, the woman on the bed, and finally Gideon, rising from his chair with danger in every line of his body. Well, well, the man said, and his voice was like gravel grinding under a boot. I've been looking all over for you, Lydia. Lydia was awake instantly, her face draining of what little color it had regained. Silas. The name was a whisper, a prayer, a curse. Silas Crane stepped into the cabin, his spurs jingling with each heavy footfall. Behind him, 2 more men waited outside, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. Did you really think you could run from me? Silas asked, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. Did you really think I wouldn't find you? The other girls were awake now, scrambling to their feet with wide, terrified eyes. June let out a small cry and ran to her mother's side. Mara positioned herself in front of Ellie, her small hands balled into fists, her chin lifted in defiance. You get out of here, Mara said, her voice shaking but fierce. You leave us alone. Silas laughed, a cold, cruel sound that made Gideon's blood boil. Listen to that. Little Mara, trying to be brave. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Lydia. You always did raise them to be fighters. Too bad it won't do them any good. What do you want, Silas? Lydia's voice was barely audible. What do I want? Silas spread his hands, all false innocence. I want what's mine, the land, the homestead, and if you won't come back willingly... His gaze slid to the 3 girls, and something predatory flickered in his eyes. Well, I'm sure the judge would be very interested to hear how you've been dragging these poor children across the wilderness, starving them, endangering them. What kind of mother does that? You lying snake, Lydia started. Careful, Silas cut her off, his voice hardening. You're in no position to call anyone a liar, not when I have witnesses. He jerked his thumb toward the men outside. Not when I have the law on my side. You don't have the law, Gideon said, speaking for the first time since Silas had entered. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. You have money and corruption. That's not the same thing. Silas turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time. His eyes narrowed. And who the hell are you? Gideon Ward. This is my land, and you're standing in my house. Ward. Silas rolled the name around in his mouth like he was tasting it. The hermit. The one who lost his whole family and went crazy. He smirked. I've heard about you. Heard you don't leave this ranch for months at a time. Heard you don't talk to anyone. Heard you might as well be dead yourself. Is there a point to this? Gideon asked calmly. The point, Silas said, stepping closer, is that this isn't your concern. These are my brother's children, my family, and I'm taking them back where they belong. They don't belong with you, Gideon said. They belong with their mother. Their mother, Silas spat the word. Their mother is a penniless widow who can't provide for them. Their mother has been dragging them through the dirt for weeks, half-starving them, putting them in danger. Any judge in the territory would agree that these girls need a proper home, a stable home. He smiled, and it was the smile of a snake about to strike. My home. No, Ellie cried out from behind Mara's protective stance. I don't want to go with him. Mama, please, don't let him take us. The sound of that little girl's terror was enough to push Gideon over an edge he didn't even know he'd been standing on. He moved before Silas could react. 3 long strides that brought him face to face with the man, so close he could smell the whiskey on his breath and the cruelty in his soul. You listen to me, Gideon said, and his voice was low and deadly. You're going to turn around. You're going to walk out that door, and you're going to ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Because if you don't, if you take one more step toward these children, I will bury you in the yard next to my wife and sons, and no one will ever find you. Silas's smile faltered. He was a bully, Gideon realized. He was used to pushing around women and children, used to using his size and his money and his connections to get what he wanted. But he wasn't used to facing a man who had already lost everything, a man who had nothing left to fear. The two stared at each other, and the air between them crackled with tension. Finally, Silas took a step back. This isn't over, he said, trying to recover his composure. You think you can protect them? You can't even protect yourself. You couldn't protect your own family. The words were designed to wound, and they did. Gideon felt them like a knife between his ribs, but he didn't flinch. I'll be back with the sheriff. I'll have papers, legal papers, and then we'll see who has the law on their side. He turned and stalked out the door, his men falling into step behind him. A moment later, Gideon heard horses galloping away into the morning light. The cabin fell silent. Then Lydia let out a sob, a deep, wrenching sound that seemed to come from the very core of her being, and collapsed back onto the bed. The girls rushed to her side, surrounding her with small arms and frightened faces. Mama, don't cry, June begged. Please don't cry. He's going to come back, Mara said, her voice flat with resignation. He always comes back. He never stops. We should run, Lydia whispered. We should keep running. Maybe if we go far enough. You can't run forever, Gideon said quietly. He was still standing near the door, his heart pounding, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. You can't run forever, and you shouldn't have to. Lydia looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. Then what do we do? He has money. He has connections. He has papers that say he's their legal guardian. What can we possibly do against all of that? Gideon was silent for a long moment. He thought about his wife. He thought about his boys. He thought about the 6 years he'd spent hiding from the world, convincing himself that if he never loved anything again, he could never be hurt again. But he'd been wrong. Because watching this woman and her children face destruction, watching them cower in fear from a monster who wanted to tear them apart, this hurt too. This was a different kind of pain, the pain of standing by while innocent people suffered, the pain of doing nothing when he had the power to do something. There might be a way, he said slowly, the idea forming even as he spoke it. There might be a way to stop him, to protect you, all of you. Lydia stared at him. How? Gideon took a deep breath. Marry me. The words hung in the air between them, shocking and impossible. Lydia's mouth fell open. The girls looked from their mother to Gideon and back again, wide-eyed. What? Lydia breathed. Marry me, Gideon repeated, more certain now. Today. Right now, if we can find a preacher. If you're my wife, those girls become my daughters. Legal. Binding. Silas can waive all the papers he wants. But a judge will think twice before taking children away from a married couple. From a father who can provide for them. But we barely know each other, Lydia stammered. We just met yesterday. This is insane. I know. Gideon moved closer, dropping to one knee beside the bed so he could look her in the eye. I know it's insane. I know it's not how things are supposed to be done. But I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for a real marriage. I'm asking you to let me protect you, to let me stand between you and that man. He glanced at the girls, huddled around their mother like chicks around a hen. To let me give these children a home where they don't have to be afraid.
Lydia was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face. Why would you do this? You don't owe us anything. No, Gideon agreed. I don't. But I've spent 6 years hiding from the world, telling myself that I was better off alone. And maybe I was.
Maybe it was easier. But easier isn't the same as right. He reached out and gently took her hand. Let me do something right, Lydia. For once in my sorry life, let me do something that matters. Lydia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected to see. Not pity, not obligation, but a kind of desperate, aching hope that mirrored her own. Mama, Ellie said, her small voice cutting through the silence. Mama, I think you should say yes. Lydia looked at her youngest daughter. Ellie, he helped us, Ellie said simply. He gave us food. He gave us blankets. He promised to watch over us. She looked at Gideon with those enormous blue eyes. I think he's a good man, Mama, and I think we need a good man. June was nodding. Ellie's right. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being scared. Even Mara, fierce Mara, who had spent the last 2 weeks carrying burdens no 12-year-old should ever have to carry, seemed to soften. He stood up to Silas, she said quietly. Nobody's ever done that before. Not even... She stopped, unable to say the word daddy. Lydia looked at each of her daughters in turn, seeing the hope in their faces, the desperate need for safety and stability, and something to believe in. Then she looked at Gideon. If I say yes, she said slowly, what kind of life are you offering? What kind of future? An honest one, Gideon replied. Hard work, early mornings, winters that'll freeze you to the bone, and summers that'll bake you dry. But also a roof over your heads, food on the table, a man who'll protect you with his last breath. He paused. And maybe, someday, something more, something real. But only if you want it, only if it grows on its own. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sun was fully risen now, painting the walls of the cabin in shades of gold. The fire crackled softly. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt almost sacred. Finally, Lydia nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Ellie let out a squeal of joy and threw her arms around Gideon's neck before he could react. He froze, startled by the contact. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with affection. But then, slowly, he hugged her back. Thank you, Ellie whispered in his ear. Thank you, Papa Gideon. Papa Gideon. The words cracked something open in his chest, something he thought had died with his sons, something that hurt so much it was almost unbearable. But somehow, miraculously, it also felt like healing. You're welcome, he managed to say, his voice rough. You're welcome, little one. Mara and June watched from beside the bed, their expressions cautious but hopeful. This wasn't the way any of them had imagined their lives going. It wasn't the fairy tale ending they might have dreamed about as children, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. The town of Dusty Hollow was 30 miles east, and it took most of the day to get there by wagon. Gideon had hitched his strongest horses to the old buckboard he rarely used anymore, and the entire group had set out just after mid-morning. Lydia in the front seat beside him, the girls bundled in blankets in the back, watching the landscape roll by with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They arrived just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the main street. The town wasn't much. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a small white church at the end of the road. But to the girls who had spent 2 weeks walking through empty wilderness, it must have seemed like a metropolis. Is that where we're getting married? June asked, pointing at the church. If the preacher's willing, Gideon said. He helped Lydia down from the wagon and turned to lift Ellie out of the back. Let's go find out. The preacher was a kind-faced man named Reverend Thomas, with white hair and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He was surprised to see Gideon Ward. The reclusive rancher hadn't set foot in his church in 6 years, but his surprise quickly turned to warm welcome when he understood the situation. A wedding, he said, his eyes twinkling. On Thanksgiving Eve, no less. Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?
Lydia managed a small smile. He certainly does. And these are your daughters? The Reverend bent down to look at the girls who were lined up beside their mother like soldiers awaiting inspection. What lovely young ladies. What are your names? Mara spoke first, her voice wary but polite. I'm Mara, sir. These are my sisters, June and Ellie. Wonderful names, strong names. The Reverend straightened and looked at Gideon. And you, Mr. Ward, are you ready for this? It's a big responsibility, becoming a father. Gideon met the man's gaze steadily. I've been a father before. I know what it means. Something flickered in the Reverend's eyes, understanding perhaps, or maybe just respect. Then let's not waste any more time. The church is empty, but we can gather a few witnesses from the town. Would you like to wait? No, Gideon said firmly. We do this now. The ceremony was simple. A handful of townspeople, the shopkeeper and his wife, the blacksmith, 2 women from the boarding house, gathered in the pews to watch as Gideon and Lydia stood before the altar. The church was cold, the light fading to dusky purple through the stained glass windows, but there was a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with temperature. The girls stood to one side, holding hands. Ellie was clutching her rag doll with her free hand, and June was trying very hard not to cry. Only Mara stood straight and watchful, her eyes never leaving the door, as if she expected Silas to burst through it at any moment. Gideon caught her eye and gave her a small nod. It's going to be okay, the nod said. I've got this. For the first time, Mara seemed to believe it. The Reverend began the vows. Do you, Gideon Ward, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health? Until death do you part? I do, Gideon said, and his voice was steady. And do you, Lydia Crane, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Lydia looked at Gideon, this stranger who had offered her everything when she had nothing, and felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but trust and hope, and gratitude so deep it almost felt like love. I do, she whispered. Then by the power vested in me. The church doors slammed open. Silas Crane strode down the aisle, his face red with fury, 2 men at his back. In his hand he waved a sheaf of papers like a weapon. Stop this ceremony, he roared. This marriage is a fraud. This woman is unfit. I have legal custody of these children, and Silas, Lydia's voice cut through his tirade like a knife. She stepped forward, away from the altar, and for the first time she didn't look afraid. Silas, you need to stop, he sneered at her. Or what? You'll have your new husband threaten me again. You think I'm scared of some washed-up hermit who can barely— I'm not threatening you, Lydia interrupted. I'm telling you the truth you've been running from for 4 months. Something flickered in Silas's eyes. The first hint of uncertainty. What are you talking about? Lydia turned to face the townspeople, the witnesses, the Reverend, everyone who had gathered to watch her marry a man she barely knew. 4 months ago, my husband died. Nathan Crane. A good man. A kind man. A man who loved his family more than anything in the world. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. His brother Silas came to our homestead the day after the funeral with papers he claimed Nathan had signed. Papers that said the land belonged to him, that he was the legal guardian of our children. She looked directly at Silas, her eyes blazing. But Nathan never signed those papers. I know, because I was with him every day of his illness. I held his hand as he died, and he spent his last breath telling me that Silas could never be trusted, that I should take the girls and run if Silas ever came for us. Murmurs rippled through the gathered witnesses. The blacksmith's wife leaned close to her husband, whispering urgently. Silas's face had gone from red to white. She's lying. She's a liar. There's a witness, Lydia said, and her voice rang with sudden strength. Dr. Hartley from our town. He was there when Nathan died. He heard everything. And he told me before we left that if I ever needed proof of what Nathan said, I should write to him. He'd swear to it in any court. That's not— And there's more.
Lydia reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and creased from weeks of travel. This is a letter. A letter Nathan wrote to me before he got sick, before he ever knew he was going to die. She unfolded it with trembling hands. In this letter he writes about his brother, about the debt Silas owes, about the lies Silas told their father to steal his inheritance, about the woman in Cripple Creek that Silas— Enough! Silas lunged forward, but the blacksmith stepped into his path, blocking him with a broad chest and a warning glare. I think we'd all like to hear the rest of that letter, the blacksmith said mildly.
Lydia looked at Silas, at the sweat on his brow, the panic in his eyes, the way his hands were shaking, and felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in months. Power. The letter goes on, she said, her voice calm now, to say that if anything ever happened to Nathan, I should take the children and go as far away from Silas as possible. Because Nathan knew even then that his brother would try to take everything from us. Not because he cared about the land or the children, but because he hated Nathan, hated him for being the better man, hated him for having the love and the family that Silas could never have. The church was utterly silent. Silas looked around wildly, searching for allies, for support, for anyone who would take his side. But the faces that looked back at him were cold, judgmental, disgusted. Get out, the Reverend said quietly, and there was steel beneath his gentle voice. Get out of my church, Mr. Crane, and do not come back.
You can't do this, Silas snarled. You can't just— Actually, the sheriff said, stepping through the doors behind Silas, I think we can. I've been listening to this whole exchange, and I've got to say, it sounds like you've got some explaining to do. Silas's face contorted with rage. He looked at Lydia, at Gideon, at the three girls huddled together near the altar. This isn't over, he spat. You hear me? This isn't— It's over. Gideon's voice was low and final. He stepped forward, placing himself between Silas and the family he'd sworn to protect. You lost. Go home. For a long, tense moment, Silas stood his ground. Then, with a snarl of frustrated fury, he turned and stormed out of the church, his men trailing behind him. The door slammed so hard the walls shook, but the silence that followed was peaceful, almost sacred. The Reverend cleared his throat. Well, he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Where were we? Ah, yes. He turned back to the altar. By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you man and wife. He looked at Gideon. You may kiss your bride. Gideon turned to Lydia. She was crying again but this time the tears were different. These were tears of relief, of hope, of a future finally within reach. He cupped her face gently in his rough, calloused hands. We did it, he murmured. We did it, she whispered back, and then very softly, very gently, he kissed her. The girls erupted into cheers. Ellie jumped up and down, clapping her hands. June burst into tears and hugged Mara, who was smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in longer than any of them could remember. The townspeople applauded. The Reverend beamed, and outside the sun finally set on Thanksgiving Eve, painting the sky in ribbons of gold and crimson, the colors of endings and beginnings, of things lost and things found. Gideon Ward had spent 6 years in darkness, but tonight, standing in that little church with his new family around him, he finally saw the light. They drove home by moonlight, the wagon creaking softly along the rutted road. The girls had fallen asleep in the back, curled together under blankets like a litter of puppies, their faces peaceful in a way they hadn't been for weeks. Lydia sat beside Gideon on the bench, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but the silence was comfortable, easy. Finally, Lydia said, What happens now? Gideon considered the question. Now we go home. Tomorrow, we cook Thanksgiving dinner. The day after that, we start figuring out how to be a family. Just like that? Just like that. He glanced at her, and in the moonlight she looked almost ethereal, pale and lovely and stronger than she knew. It won't be easy. We barely know each other. We're going to make mistakes, step on each other's toes, probably argue about 100 things we haven't even thought of yet. That sounds realistic. It's the only way I know how to be. Gideon turned his attention back to the road. But I promise you this, Lydia. I will never raise a hand to you or those girls. I will never leave you, and I will spend every day of my life trying to make sure you never regret saying yes. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and took his hand. I already don't regret it, she said softly. They held hands the rest of the way home. Awesome. The cabin looked different when they arrived, or maybe it just felt different. The same walls, the same roof, the same fireplace with its dying embers. But somehow it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a home. Gideon carried the sleeping girls inside one by one, laying them on the bed that would need to be shared until he could build more. Lydia tucked them in, brushing hair from their faces, kissing their foreheads, murmuring prayers of gratitude that they were finally safe. Then she and Gideon stood together by the fireplace, watching the last flames flicker into darkness. Thank you, Lydia said. I know I've said it before, but thank you for everything. Gideon shook his head. You don't have to keep thanking me. Yes, I do. Because you saved us. You saved my children. She turned to face him, and there were tears on her cheeks again, but also a smile. Whatever happens next, whatever the future holds, I will never forget that, and neither will they. Gideon looked at the three small figures sleeping on the bed. Mara, with her fierce protective love. June, with her gentle heart. Ellie, with her enormous eyes and endless hope. His family, his daughters. The word still felt strange, fragile, like something precious that might shatter if he held it too tightly. But he was going to try. For the first time in 6 years, he was going to try. Get some sleep, he told Lydia. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving. There's going to be a lot of work to do. What about you? He smiled, and even he was surprised by how natural it felt. I think I'll stay up a little longer. Keep an eye on things. Lydia nodded. She hesitated, then rose on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. Good night, husband, she whispered. Good night, wife. She went to the bed and curled up beside her daughters, and within minutes, her breathing had slowed to the rhythm of sleep. Gideon watched them for a long time. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the night sky. The moon was high now, casting silver light across the valley. The stars were scattered across the heavens like diamonds spilled on black velvet. Somewhere out there, he knew, Sarah was watching. Thomas and Samuel, too. His first family, the family he had lost, the family he would never stop loving. But maybe, just maybe, they would understand. Maybe they would be happy. Maybe, after 6 years of silence and solitude and grief, it was finally time for Gideon Ward to live again. He closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, I'm going to try. I'm going to try to be happy. I hope you understand. The wind rustled through the trees outside, soft as a whisper. And somewhere in the depths of his heart, Gideon could have sworn he heard Sarah's voice, gentle and warm as it had always been. We know, my love. We know. Now go. Live. Love again. We'll be waiting. When he opened his eyes, the stars seemed brighter than before. And for the first time in 6 years, Gideon Ward smiled, really smiled, and felt something that had been dead inside him slowly, tentatively, begin to bloom. Hope, Hosem. The night settled around the cabin like a blessing. Inside, a man and his new family slept peacefully, protected from the cold and the darkness by walls that no longer felt like prison. Outside, the wind sang its ancient song across the valley, carrying whispers of things to come, challenges and joys, struggles and triumphs, all the messy, beautiful chaos of a life lived together. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, there was only this: a knock on a door, a choice to help, and the first small steps of a journey that would change 5 lives forever. Gideon Ward had opened his door to strangers, and in doing so, he had finally opened his heart. Morning came slowly to the valley, creeping over the mountain ridges like a cautious animal unsure of its welcome. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, casting long golden rectangles across the wooden floor and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still air. Gideon woke before anyone else, as he always did. For 6 years, sleep had been his enemy. A dark place filled with rushing water and screaming voices, and hands reaching for him that he could never quite grasp. He had trained himself to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest sound, to greet each dawn as both a relief and a burden. But this morning felt different. He lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin was filled with sounds he hadn't heard in years. The soft breathing of children, the rustle of blankets, the small, contented sigh of someone dreaming peaceful dreams. Gideon turned his head and looked at the bed across the room. Lydia was curled on her side, one arm draped protectively over Ellie, who had burrowed against her mother's chest like a small animal seeking warmth. June lay sprawled on her back, her mouth slightly open, her freckled face relaxed in sleep. And Mara, fierce, watchful Mara, had finally let her guard down, her features softened into something approaching innocence. His family. The thought still felt foreign, impossible, like trying to hold water in his hands, but it was real. They were real, and today was Thanksgiving. Gideon rose quietly and dressed in the half-darkness, pulling on his boots and shrugging into his worn leather jacket. He needed to check on the animals, start the fire, begin preparing for the day ahead. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done, and he found comfort in the familiar routines that had kept him sane these past 6 years. He was halfway to the door when a small voice stopped him. "Papa Gideon?" He turned. Ellie was sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes with small fists, her rag doll clutched against her chest. In the dim light, she looked like a painting, all soft edges and enormous eyes and tangled golden hair. "Go back to sleep, little one," Gideon said softly. "It's early yet." "Where are you going?" "Just outside. I need to feed the animals and check on the horses." Ellie considered this for a moment. Then she pushed back the blankets and slid out of bed, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "Can I come with you?" Gideon hesitated. He wasn't used to having company on his morning rounds. He wasn't used to having company at all. But there was something in the little girl's face, a desperate need to be close to him, to prove to herself that he was real, that he wasn't going to disappear. That made it impossible to refuse. "All right," he said, "but put on your shoes and grab a blanket. It's cold out there." Ellie's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. She scrambled to find her shoes, hopping on one foot as she pulled them on, then wrapped herself in the lavender-scented blanket and scurried to his side. "Ready," she announced. They stepped out into the morning together. The world outside was painted in shades of silver and gold, the frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke and the faint, earthy smell of cattle. In the distance, the mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks dusted with early snow. Ellie gasped. "It's beautiful." Gideon looked down at her, at the wonder in her eyes, and felt something crack open in his chest. His boys had loved mornings like this. Thomas would race ahead, pretending to be an explorer discovering new lands. Samuel would stay close to his father's side, asking endless questions about the birds and the trees and the clouds. "It is," Gideon agreed quietly. "Come on, let's say good morning to the horses." The stable was warm and fragrant, filled with the comfortable sounds of animals stirring awake. Gideon led Ellie down the row of stalls, introducing her to each horse by name. "This is Dusty. She's old and cranky, but she's the most reliable horse I've got. And this is Thunder. Don't let the name fool you. He's gentle as a lamb. And this big fellow here, this is Solomon. He was my wife's favorite." Ellie reached up to touch Solomon's velvety nose. The horse lowered his head and huffed softly, his warm breath ruffling her hair. "He likes me," Ellie said, delighted. "He does." Gideon watched the girl and the horse together, and the ache in his chest intensified. Sarah would have loved this child. Sarah would have scooped her up and spun her around and made her laugh until she couldn't breathe. But Sarah was gone, and somehow, impossibly, this little girl was here instead. "Papa Gideon?" Ellie's voice pulled him back to the present. "Yes?" "Can I tell you a secret?" He crouched down so he was at her eye level. "You can tell me anything." Ellie glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then she leaned close and whispered, "I was really scared. Before we found you, I was scared we were going to die." Gideon's heart clenched.
You're not going to die. I won't let anything happen to you. I know. Ellie's voice was a matter of fact, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. That's why I'm not scared anymore, because you're here now. She reached up and touched his face with one small hand. You have sad eyes, but I think they're getting less sad. Gideon didn't trust himself to speak. He simply pulled the little girl into his arms and held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her small body against his chest. Thank you, he finally managed to say. Thank you for trusting me. Ellie wrapped her arms around his neck. Thank you for being our papa. They stayed like that for a long moment, the man and the child, two lost souls who had somehow found each other in the vast wilderness of grief and hope. Then Ellie pulled back and announced, I'm hungry. Gideon laughed, a real laugh, rusty with disuse but genuine. Then let's go see about making some breakfast. By the time they returned to the cabin, the others were awake. June was helping Lydia stoke the fire, and Mara was folding blankets with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned to take care of herself long before she should have had to. There you are, Lydia said, relief evident in her voice. I woke up and Ellie was gone. I thought she was helping me with the horses, Gideon said quickly. I should have left a note. I'm sorry. Lydia's expression softened. It's all right. She shook her head. Old habits. After everything we've been through, I still expect the worst. The worst is over, Gideon said, and he meant it. Silas can't touch you now. Not legally, not any other way. You're safe here. Are we? Mara's voice cut through the warmth of the moment like a knife. She had stopped folding blankets and was standing with her arms crossed, her eyes hard. Because last I checked, that man threatened to come back. He said he'd bring papers. He said he'd bring the sheriff. The sheriff already knows the truth, Gideon reminded her. He heard everything your mother said. He saw Silas for what he is. That was one sheriff in one town, Mara shot back. Silas has money. He has connections. He has friends in places we don't even know about. You think this is over just because we had a wedding and made some pretty speeches? You think a man like that just gives up? Mara, Lydia's voice was gentle but firm. That's enough. It's not enough, Mama. Mara's voice cracked, and suddenly she wasn't a fierce young warrior anymore. She was just a scared 12-year-old girl who had seen too much and carried too much and been failed by too many adults who should have protected her. It's never enough. We thought we were safe before. We thought Daddy would always be there, and then he died, and Silas came, and everything— She choked on the words. Everything fell apart. The cabin fell silent. Lydia crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Mara resisted for a moment, her body stiff, but then she collapsed against her mother's chest and began to sob. Great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. I know, Lydia murmured, stroking her daughter's hair. I know, sweetheart. I know. Gideon watched them, feeling helpless. He knew grief. He knew fear. But he didn't know how to comfort a child who had every reason to believe the world was cruel and unfair and relentlessly dangerous. Then Ellie tugged at his sleeve. He looked down at her. She was watching her sister with worried eyes, her ragdoll pressed against her heart. Mara's really sad, Ellie whispered. She pretends to be strong, but she's really sad inside. She cries at night when she thinks we're asleep. Gideon nodded slowly. He crouched down and looked Ellie in the eye. What do you do when she cries? He asked. I pretend to be asleep, Ellie admitted, because I think she'd be embarrassed if she knew I heard, but sometimes I scoot closer to her, so she knows she's not alone. Gideon's throat tightened. This tiny child, who had been through hell and back, still had the capacity to think about others, still had the instinct to offer comfort even when she needed it herself. That's a good thing to do, he said. Keep doing that, and let me worry about Silas. Do you promise? I promise. Across the room, Mara's sobs had begun to subside. She pulled back from her mother, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry, she mumbled. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. Gideon's voice was firm but kind. He crossed the room and stood before her, his hands at his sides, his expression open. You have every right to be scared. You have every right to be angry. You've been through more in the past few months than most people face in a lifetime, and you've handled it with more courage and grace than anyone could have expected. Mara stared at him, her red-rimmed eyes suspicious. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. Then tell me. The challenge hung in the air between them. Mara's jaw tightened. When Silas came to our house that night, the night Mama told you about, he tried to grab me. He said things, horrible things, and She swallowed hard. I hit him with a fireplace poker. I hit him as hard as I could. Good, Gideon said simply. Mara blinked. What? Good. He deserved it. I only wish you'd hit him harder. For a long moment, Mara just stared at him. Then, impossibly, the corner of her mouth twitched. He bled a lot, she said, all over his fancy shirt. Even better. And then Mara laughed. A small, surprised sound, like a bird that had forgotten it could sing. It wasn't much, but it was something. Okay, she said finally, her voice still shaky but stronger than before. Okay, maybe I can try. Try to believe that things will be different this time. That's all I ask, Gideon said. Just try. Lydia caught his eye across the room, and the gratitude in her gaze was overwhelming. He looked away quickly, unused to being looked at like that. Like he mattered. Like he was worth something. Well, he said gruffly, clearing his throat, we should probably eat something. It's Thanksgiving after all. And I believe someone mentioned being hungry. Ellie bounced on her toes. That was me! I'm starving. Then let's see what we can put together. The next few hours were filled with a kind of organized chaos that Gideon had almost forgotten existed. Lydia took charge of the kitchen, issuing orders like a general commanding troops. June was sent to fetch water from the well. Mara was tasked with peeling potatoes. Ellie was given the all-important job of setting the table, which she took extremely seriously. And Gideon did whatever needed to be done. He chopped firewood. He retrieved supplies from the root cellar. He killed and plucked a turkey he'd been saving for exactly this occasion, though he'd never imagined he'd have anyone to share it with. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at the activity inside the cabin. Through the window, he could see Lydia laughing at something June had said. He could see Mara's stern expression softening as Ellie danced around the table with the silverware. He could see the beginnings of something that looked almost like joy, fragile and tentative, but real. This is what it feels like, he thought. This is what I lost. This is what I thought I'd never have again. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had to lean against the woodpile for a moment, breathing hard, willing himself not to break down right there in the yard. He had spent 6 years convincing himself that he was fine, that he didn't need anyone, that the walls he'd built around his heart were protecting him, not imprisoning him. But he'd been wrong. He'd been so wrong. The truth was, he had been dying. Slowly, quietly, day by day, he had been dying from the inside out. The loneliness hadn't kept him safe. It had been killing him as surely as any disease. And now, against all odds, he had been given a second chance. Gideon closed his eyes and made a silent vow. He would not waste it. He would not let fear hold him back. Whatever it took, whatever he had to do, he would protect this family and give them the life they deserved. Whatever it took. The Thanksgiving feast was modest by most standards. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy made from drippings, a few preserved vegetables from the root cellar, and a cobbler that Lydia somehow managed to create from dried apples, and a handful of precious flour. But to the 5 people gathered around the small table, it might as well have been a royal banquet. This is amazing, June said, her mouth full of potato. Mama, this is the best food I've ever tasted. Don't talk with your mouth full, Lydia chided, but she was smiling. And it's not that good. We didn't have half the ingredients I would have wanted. It's perfect, Gideon said quietly. Every bit of it. Lydia looked at him across the table, and something passed between them, something warm and fragile and full of possibility. Thank you, she said softly, for all of this. You did most of the work. I meant,
She gestured around the cabin, at the fire crackling in the hearth, at the children eating their fill, at the walls that stood between them and the cold, cruel world outside. All of this, everything you've done for us. You don't have to keep thanking me, Gideon said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. This is your home now. What I do for you, I do for family. The word hung in the air between them. Family. It was Ellie who broke the moment. Can we say what we're thankful for? She asked, bouncing in her seat. Mama always makes us say what we're thankful for on Thanksgiving. Lydia smiled. That's right, we do. Who wants to go first? Me! Me! Ellie's hand shot up. I'm thankful for this food because I was so hungry for so long and now I'm not hungry anymore. And I'm thankful for the horses because Solomon is my new best friend. And I'm thankful for Papa Gideon because he saved us. And now we have a house, and we don't have to sleep in fields anymore. Gideon felt his throat tighten. Thank you, Ellie. You're welcome, Papa Gideon. June went next, her voice softer than her sister's, but just as sincere. I'm thankful we found somewhere safe. I'm thankful Mama didn't have to marry that horrible man. And I'm thankful Mara doesn't have to be so scared all the time anymore. Mara ducked her head, suddenly very interested in her plate. But when her turn came, she looked up and met Gideon's eyes directly. I'm thankful, she said slowly, that there are still good people in the world. I was starting to think there weren't, but I was wrong. She paused. I'm glad I was wrong. Lydia reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. I'm thankful for my girls, she said, for their strength and their courage and their love. I'm thankful that God led us to this door when we had nowhere else to go. And I'm thankful for the man who opened it, even when he had every reason to keep it closed. All eyes turned to Gideon. He sat very still, his hands flat on the table, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't good at this. He hadn't been good at it even before Sarah died, and 6 years of silence had only made it worse. But these people, his family, were looking at him with expectation and hope, and he couldn't let them down. I'm thankful, he began, and his voice cracked. He stopped, cleared his throat, tried again. I'm thankful for a knock on my door. I'm thankful for the courage of 4 women who walked through hell to find their way here. I'm thankful for the chance to... He stopped again, his eyes burning. To what? Ellie prompted gently. Gideon looked at her enormous blue eyes, at her innocent face, at the rag doll clutched in her arms. And he thought of Samuel, who had been about her age when he died. Samuel, who had loved to ask questions. Samuel, who had believed his father could do anything. To feel alive again, Gideon finished quietly. I'm thankful to feel alive again. The silence that followed was profound, but it wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding, of shared grief and shared hope, of people who had found each other in the darkness and were learning, slowly, to walk toward the light. Then Ellie clapped her hands. Now we eat, she announced. And they did. After dinner, the girls helped clear the table while Lydia washed the dishes. Gideon sat in his chair by the fire, watching the domestic scene unfold with a sense of wonder he couldn't quite articulate. This is real, he kept thinking. This is actually happening. But even as he allowed himself to feel a moment of peace, a shadow lurked at the edge of his consciousness, a shadow with Silas Crane's face. The man had been humiliated, yes, exposed in front of a church full of witnesses, thrown out by the sheriff. But men like Silas didn't accept defeat gracefully. They plotted, they schemed, they waited for their moment, and they always came back. Gideon knew this in his bones. Whatever temporary victory they had won, the war was far from over. Silas would be out there somewhere, licking his wounds, gathering his resources, planning his next move. The question was when and how he would strike. As if reading his thoughts, Lydia appeared at his side. She had dried her hands on her apron and was looking at him with eyes that saw too much. You're thinking about him, she said softly. About Silas. Gideon nodded. He's not going to stop. I know. Lydia sank into the chair across from him, her face tired but resolute. He's always been that way. Even when Nathan was alive, Silas was consumed by jealousy, by resentment. He believed the world owed him something, and when he didn't get it, He blamed everyone but himself. "Tell me more," Gideon said. "Tell me everything. If I'm going to protect this family, I need to understand what we're dealing with." Lydia was silent for a moment, her eyes distant. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Silas and Nathan were born 2 years apart," she began. "Same mother, same father, but you'd never know it to look at them. Nathan was kind, hardworking, honest to a fault. Silas was," she shook her head, "different. Even as a boy, he was cruel. He'd torment animals, bully smaller children, lie to get others in trouble." "And their parents?" "Their mother died when they were young. Their father," Lydia's expression darkened. "Their father was a weak man. He saw what Silas was becoming, but he couldn't bring himself to do anything about it. Instead, he favored him, gave him money, made excuses for his behavior, let him get away with things that would have gotten Nathan whipped." Gideon's jaw tightened. That kind of coddling never ends well. It didn't. When their father died, he left everything to be divided equally between the brothers. But the will was unclear, ambiguous, and Silas had a lawyer friend who helped him interpret it in his favor. Lydia's voice turned bitter. "Nathan ended up with a small piece of land and a few head of cattle. Silas got the house, the main property, most of the money. But Nathan didn't fight it. He tried, for a while. But the legal battles drained what little resources he had, and in the end he decided it wasn't worth it. He said he'd rather build something new than tear himself apart fighting for something old." Lydia smiled sadly. "That was Nathan, always looking forward, always believing things would work out if he just worked hard enough." "And Silas?" "Silas blew through his inheritance in a few years, gambling, drinking, bad investments. By the time Nathan had built our homestead into something prosperous, Silas had nothing left but debts and bitterness." Lydia's hands clenched in her lap. "He started coming around, making threats, demanding money. Nathan tried to help him, gave him loans that were never repaid, offered him work that he never showed up for. But nothing was ever enough. Nothing was ever fair." Gideon leaned forward. "And after Nathan died?" Lydia's face went pale. "Silas showed up the day after the funeral, before we'd even finished grieving. He had papers, documents he claimed Nathan had signed, transferring everything to him in case of death." Her voice shook with barely suppressed rage. "Forged! All of them forged! Nathan would never have done that. He knew what kind of man his brother was. But you couldn't prove it. Not without time. Not without money. Not without lawyers of my own." Lydia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Silas made it clear that if I tried to fight him, he would make our lives a living hell. He had the sheriff in his pocket, not the one here, a different one in our county. He had judges who owed him favors. He had friends who would lie for him, threaten for him, do whatever he asked. "So you ran." "I didn't see any other choice." Lydia looked toward the bed where her daughters had finally settled for the night, their small forms rising and falling with peaceful breath. "He was going to take my girls. He said if I didn't leave quietly, he'd have them declared wards of his household. Said he'd tell the court I was an unfit mother. Said he'd—" She stopped, unable to continue. Gideon reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to say any more." "But you need to know." Lydia gripped his fingers tightly, desperately. "He said things about Mara, about what he'd do to her when she was old enough, about how pretty she was going to be." Her voice broke. "That was when I knew we had to run. That night, no matter what it cost us." A cold rage settled in Gideon's chest. It was different from the hot, explosive anger he'd felt when Silas had burst into the church. This was something deeper, something quieter, something that would not rest until Silas Crane had been dealt with once and for all. "He'll come back," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. "He always comes back." "Then we'll be ready." Lydia looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "How can you be so calm about this? You've only known us for 2 days. You married a stranger to protect children who aren't even yours. And now you're talking about facing down a dangerous man who has resources you can't match and connections you can't fight. Why? Why would you do this?"
Gideon was silent for a long moment. Because I couldn't save them, he finally said. My wife, my boys. I heard the water coming, and I tried to reach them, but I was too slow, too weak. I watched the river take them, one by one, and there was nothing I could do. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were reciting facts from a ledger book. But his eyes were storms of grief and guilt and endless unresolved pain. I lived, he continued. I don't know why, but I lived. And for 6 years I've been trying to figure out what the point is. Why I'm still here when they're not. Why I keep waking up every morning in an empty house, eating meals alone. Going through the motions of a life that doesn't mean anything. He looked at Lydia and his eyes were raw. Then you showed up. You and your girls. And for the first time in 6 years, I felt something other than guilt. I felt purpose. Like maybe there was a reason I survived. Like maybe I was being given a chance to do what I couldn't do before. To save someone, Lydia said softly. To save someone, Gideon agreed. To stand between danger and the innocent. To be the man I should have been that night by the river. He squeezed her hand. I can't bring them back. I can't undo what happened. But I can protect you. I can keep your daughters safe. And if Silas Crane wants to take them, he'll have to go through me first. Tears were streaming down Lydia's face now. You don't owe us this. It's not about owing. It's about who I want to be, who I need to be. Gideon's voice hardened. And I need to be the man who stands up, not the man who hides, not anymore. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, the night pressing in around the cabin like a living thing. Outside, an owl hooted in the distance, and the wind whispered through the trees like the voices of ghosts. Finally, Lydia spoke. He has a temper, she said. Silas, when things don't go his way, he loses control. That's his weakness. Gideon nodded slowly. Good to know. And he's arrogant. He underestimates people. He underestimated me. Thought I'd be too scared to fight back, too weak to run. He underestimated you too. Thought you were just some crazy hermit who would back down when he showed up with his men. Also good to know. Lydia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know what he'll do next. But whatever it is, I want you to promise me something. Name it. She looked at him steadily. Promise me you won't do anything reckless. Promise me you won't get yourself killed trying to protect us. Those girls have already lost one father. I won't let them lose another. Gideon's chest tightened. Father. It was the first time she'd called him that. The first time she'd acknowledged what he was becoming to her children, what he was already becoming in their hearts. I promise, he said. I'll be careful. Good. Lydia rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. Then I suppose we should get some sleep. Tomorrow's a new day and there's work to be done. She started toward the bed where the girls were sleeping, then stopped and turned back. Gideon? Yes? She crossed the room in 3 quick steps, rose on her toes and kissed him. Not on the cheek this time, but on the lips. It was a brief kiss, gentle and tentative. The kiss of a woman who had almost forgotten what it felt like to trust. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Before he could respond, she was gone, slipping into bed beside her daughters, leaving Gideon alone by the fire with the taste of her on his lips and the warmth of her words in his heart. He sat there for a long time, staring into the flames, thinking about the past and the future and the thin, fragile line between them. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow I'll start fortifying the ranch, check the fences, inventory the weapons, talk to some of the neighbors, see if anyone knows anything about Silas's movements. But tonight he would allow himself this moment, this small, precious moment of peace. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the vast, dark sky. Inside, a family slept soundly for the first time in weeks. And in the chair by the fire, a man who had been dead for 6 years began slowly, tentatively, to come back to life. The following days settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, though Gideon knew better than to let his guard down completely. Mornings were for chores, feeding the livestock, mending fences, chopping wood. Afternoons were for teaching the girls the basics of ranch life, a task that proved both more challenging and more rewarding than Gideon had anticipated.
Mara took to the work with fierce determination, throwing herself into every task as if she had something to prove. She learned to saddle a horse in 3 days, to shoot a rifle in 5. She rarely smiled, but there was a new steadiness in her eyes, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. June was gentler, more hesitant. She preferred the company of the animals to the harder physical labor, spending hours in the stable talking to the horses or sitting in the chicken coop, watching the hens peck at their feed. She had a gift for nurturing, Gideon realized, a natural instinct for care and tenderness that would serve her well. And Ellie was everywhere at once, a small whirlwind of energy and curiosity. She asked 1,000 questions a day, followed Gideon around like a shadow, and insisted on helping with everything even when her help was more hindrance than assistance. She had started calling him Papa Gideon without any prompting, and every time she said it, something in his chest cracked open a little more. Lydia, for her part, had taken over the domestic side of the operation with quiet efficiency. The cabin, which had been little more than a storage space for Gideon's grief, was transformed into a home. She cleaned and organized, mended and improved, turning the bare walls into something warm and welcoming. She cooked meals that filled the cabin with smells Gideon had forgotten existed. She sang while she worked, soft, lilting melodies that reminded him of Sarah. And at night, after the children were asleep, she and Gideon would sit by the fire and talk. They talked about everything. His life before the flood, his courtship with Sarah, the birth of his sons, the dreams they'd had for the future, her life before Nathan's death, the struggles of frontier living, the joy of watching her daughters grow, the love she'd felt for a man who had been taken too soon. They talked about fear and grief and hope and loss, peeling back the layers of their souls like the skins of an onion. It wasn't romantic, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that felt like the foundation being laid for a house that hadn't been built yet. But always, beneath the warmth and the growing connection, there was the shadow. Silas. Gideon had ridden into town 3 days after Thanksgiving, ostensibly to buy supplies, but really to gather information. What he learned was not encouraging. "He's been asking around," the shopkeeper told him, his voice low and nervous. "Silas Crane. Came through just yesterday, wanting to know who you are, where you came from, how long you've been here. Said he was looking for his brother's widow and her children, said they'd been kidnapped by a stranger." Gideon's jaw tightened. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing, Mr. Ward. Nothing at all. After what happened at the church, most folks around here aren't too inclined to help that man." The shopkeeper paused. "But not everyone feels the same way. He's got money, and money talks. There are people in this town who'd sell their own mothers for the right price." "Anyone I should know about?" The shopkeeper hesitated. "Earl Brennan. Works at the livery stable. He and Silas were talking for a long time yesterday. I don't know what was said, but Earl was smiling when Silas left. And Earl only smiles when there's money involved." Gideon filed the information away. "Thank you. I appreciate the warning. Just be careful, Mr. Ward. That man has a look in his eye, a dangerous look. Whatever he's planning, it ain't going to be pretty." Gideon rode home with the supplies and a heavy heart. He didn't tell Lydia about the conversation. There was no point in worrying her more than she already was. But he redoubled his efforts to prepare the ranch for whatever might come. He checked and rechecked the fence lines. He oiled his rifles and counted his ammunition. He spoke with the neighboring ranchers, most of whom remembered him from before and were willing to keep an eye out for trouble. He even made a visit to the sheriff in Dusty Hollow, explaining the situation in full and securing a promise of assistance if things went sideways. But all the preparation in the world couldn't stop the dread that settled in his gut. Something was coming. He could feel it the way he'd felt the flood coming all those years ago. A distant rumble on the horizon, a change in the air, a sense that the world was about to tilt on its axis. The confrontation came on a gray December morning, 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. Gideon was in the stable, mucking out stalls, when he heard the sound of approaching hooves. Not one horse. Multiple. He set down the pitchfork and stepped outside, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. 6 riders were coming up the road. At their head was Silas Crane, his face twisted into an expression of smug satisfaction. Behind him rode 5 men Gideon didn't recognize. Hired muscle, by the look of them, rough-faced and heavily armed. "Mr. Ward." Silas called out as he brought his horse to a stop in front of the cabin. "So good to see you again. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Gideon said nothing. He just stood there, his eyes moving from face to face, assessing the threat. The cabin door opened and Lydia stepped out onto the porch. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "What do you want, Silas?" "What do I want?" Silas laughed, that same cold, cruel laugh Gideon had heard in the church. "I want what's mine. I want my brother's children. I want the land that was stolen from me, and I want that sham of a marriage annulled so we can all move on with our lives." "That's not going to happen," Gideon said quietly. Silas's smile faltered. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Ward. You see, I've been doing some research, talking to some people, and it turns out that you're not quite the upstanding citizen you pretend to be." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket and waved it in the air. "This is an affidavit, signed by 3 witnesses who swear they saw you drinking in a saloon in Miller's Creek just 2 days before your wedding, drinking heavily, making threats, saying things about how you couldn't wait to get your hands on those pretty little girls." Lydia gasped. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Silas's eyes glittered. "Can you prove it? Can you prove where your husband was on that particular night? Can you prove he didn't say those things?" Gideon's blood ran cold. He had been in Miller's Creek that night. He'd gone to buy a new saddle and had stopped at the saloon for a single drink before heading home. But he hadn't said anything to anyone. He hadn't made any threats. It was a setup, a carefully constructed trap. "Those witnesses are lying," he said flatly. "Prove it." Silas's smile returned, wider than before. "In the meantime, I have here a court order from Judge Patterson in Redwater County, requiring the immediate transfer of the Crane children into my custody, pending an investigation into their current living situation." He held up another piece of paper. "The sheriff from Redwater is on his way as we speak. He should be here within the hour, and when he arrives, he's going to take those girls, by force if necessary, and return them to their rightful guardian." Silas's voice dropped to a silky whisper. "Me." Inside the cabin, Gideon heard a child crying. Ellie, probably. Or maybe June. It didn't matter. The sound cut through him like a knife. "You're not taking them," he said, and his voice was low and dangerous. "Not today. Not ever." Silas laughed. "And how exactly do you plan to stop me? You're one man with a pistol. I have 6. The law is on my side. The courts are on my side. You've got nothing." Gideon's hand tightened on his revolver. "Gideon." Lydia's voice was sharp. "Don't!" He looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes. Not fear of Silas, fear for him. Fear that he would do something reckless, something that would get him killed. And she was right. If he drew his weapon now, he'd be dead in seconds. And then what? Lydia and the girls would be alone, defenseless against a man who had just demonstrated he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He forced himself to let go of the revolver. "Smart choice," Silas said. "Now I'm going to give you one chance to do this the easy way. Hand over the girls, sign a document renouncing your marriage, and I'll let you live. You can go back to being the sad, lonely hermit you were before these people showed up on your doorstep. And if I refuse," Silas's expression hardened, "then things are going to get very unpleasant, for everyone." The air crackled with tension. The hired men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. Lydia stood frozen on the porch, her face white as chalk. And then, from inside the cabin, came the sound of a shotgun being cocked. Everyone turned. Mara stood in the doorway, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at Silas's chest. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were steady. "You're not taking us anywhere," she said, and her voice didn't waver. "I'll shoot you dead before I let you touch my sisters." Silas stared at her, his mouth slightly open. For a moment he seemed genuinely taken aback. Then he laughed. "Well, well, little Mara's grown some teeth." He shook his head. "Put the gun down, girl. You're not going to shoot anyone. Try me." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. And then, from down the road, came the sound of more hooves. Everyone turned to look. A group of riders was approaching. 8, maybe 10. At their head was the sheriff from Dusty Hollow, his badge glinting in the gray morning light. Beside him rode Reverend Thomas, his white hair streaming behind him. And behind them came a dozen men and women from town, all armed, all grim-faced. The shopkeeper was there, the blacksmith, the women from the boarding house, farmers and ranchers and ordinary citizens who had heard what was happening and decided to do something about it. "What's going on here?" the sheriff demanded as he brought his horse to a stop. Silas's face went red. "This is none of your concern. I have a court order." "I've seen your court order," the sheriff interrupted. "Showed it to Judge Morrison over in Dusty Hollow. He says it's not worth the paper it's printed on. Patterson doesn't have jurisdiction here, and even if he did, the affidavit it's based on is full of lies." "That's not—" "Furthermore," the sheriff continued, his voice hardening, "I've received reports that you've been bribing witnesses, intimidating townspeople, and making threats against citizens of this territory. That's a crime, Mr. Crane. Multiple crimes, in fact." Silas's eyes darted from face to face, searching for allies. But there were none to be found. Even his hired men were starting to look nervous, their hands moving away from their weapons. "I suggest," the sheriff said slowly, "that you turn around, ride back to wherever you came from, and never set foot in this territory again. Because if you do, if I ever hear that you've come within 50 miles of this ranch or these people, I will personally see to it that you spend the next 20 years in a prison cell. Do I make myself clear?" Silas's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Do I make myself clear, Mr. Crane?" For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Silas wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You hear me? This isn't—" "Ride," the sheriff said. "Now." And Silas rode. His men followed, their horses kicking up dust as they retreated down the road. Within minutes, they were gone, swallowed by the gray December morning like ghosts fleeing the dawn. Gideon stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. It was over. It was finally, truly over. Lydia came down from the porch and threw her arms around him, sobbing into his chest. Behind her, Mara slowly lowered the shotgun, her face crumpling as the adrenaline drained away. June and Ellie burst out of the cabin and ran to their mother, wrapping themselves around her legs like vines around a tree. The sheriff rode over and tipped his hat. "Looks like you've made some friends, Mr. Ward." Gideon looked at the assembled townspeople, the men and women who had ridden out in the cold December morning to help a family they barely knew, simply because it was the right thing to do. "I suppose I have," he said quietly. The sheriff smiled. "Happy to help, and for what it's worth, welcome back to the living." He turned his horse and led the group back toward town, their hoofbeats fading into the distance like the last echoes of a storm. Gideon stood in the yard, surrounded by his family, and felt something shift inside him. The weight he had been carrying for 6 years, the guilt, the grief, the crushing loneliness, didn't disappear. But it lightened. Just a little, just enough. "Papa Gideon?" Ellie's small voice broke through his thoughts. He looked down at her. "Yes?" "Is the bad man gone? Really gone?" Gideon picked her up and held her close, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck, feeling her heart beat against his chest. "He's gone," he said, "and he's never coming back." Ellie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good, because I like it here, and I don't want to leave." "You're not going anywhere," Gideon promised. "None of you are. This is home now. This is where you belong." Lydia looked up at him, her eyes still wet with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Home," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." Mara had set down the shotgun and was standing a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression unreadable. Gideon caught her eye. "You were very brave," he said. "Stupid, but brave." The corner of Mara's mouth twitched. "I learned from watching you." "Then I suppose I'm a bad influence." "The worst." But she was smiling now, really smiling. And when Gideon opened his arm to her, she hesitated only a moment before stepping into the embrace. They stood there in the yard, the 5 of them, holding on to each other as the gray morning slowly brightened around them. The wind had died down. The clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing patches of blue sky. And somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. The days that followed Silas's retreat should have been peaceful. The threat had been driven away, the sheriff had made his position clear, and the townspeople had demonstrated their willingness to stand against tyranny. By all rights, the Ward family should have been able to settle into their new life without fear. But peace, Gideon knew, was a fragile thing. And men like Silas Crane didn't accept defeat. They merely regrouped. It was 3 weeks after the confrontation when the first letter arrived. Lydia found it nailed to the fence post at the edge of the property, its paper yellowed and water-stained from the morning dew. She brought it to Gideon without opening it, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. "It's his handwriting," she said. "I'd recognize it anywhere." Gideon took the letter and unfolded it carefully. The words inside were written in a cramped, angry script that seemed to vibrate with barely contained fury. "You think you've won," Gideon read aloud, his voice flat. "You think your little display of frontier justice means something. But I'm patient, I'm resourceful, and I have friends in places you cannot imagine. The girls belong to me. They will always belong to me. And one day, when you least expect it, I will come for what is mine. Sleep well, Mrs. Crane. Or should I say Mrs. Ward? Your new name won't protect you. Nothing will protect you." Lydia's face had gone from pale to ashen. "He's not going to stop." "No." Gideon crumpled the letter in his fist. "He's not." "What do we do?" It was a question Gideon had been asking himself for days. The sheriff's warning had been clear and legally sound, but Silas wasn't operating within the bounds of law anymore. He was operating on pure hatred, pure obsession, and there was no court order, no sheriff's badge, no frontier justice that could protect against a man who had nothing left to lose. "We stay vigilant," Gideon said finally. "We don't let the girls go anywhere alone. We keep the guns loaded and the doors barred at night." He looked at Lydia, his expression grim. "And we hope that he's bluffing." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Silas Crane wasn't the type to bluff. He was the type to bide his time, to nurture his grievances until they festered into something monstrous. Sooner or later, he would make his move. The question was whether they would be ready when he did. Christmas came and went with a quiet celebration that felt more hopeful than any of them had expected. Gideon had ridden into town and purchased small gifts for each of the girls, a new ribbon for Mara's hair, a journal with a leather cover for June, and a porcelain-faced doll for Ellie to replace the tattered rag doll she'd been carrying since they left their old home. Ellie's reaction alone was worth every penny. "She's beautiful," she squealed, clutching the doll to her chest. "She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. What's her name?" "You get to decide that," Gideon said, a smile tugging at his lips. "She's yours now." Ellie considered this with the gravity of a judge deliberating a capital case. "I'm going to call her Hope," she announced finally, "because you gave her to me, and you gave us hope when we didn't have any." Gideon had to turn away to hide the moisture in his eyes. The winter deepened, bringing snow that blanketed the valley in white, and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the well froze solid every night. The family huddled together in the cabin, keeping the fire roaring and the blankets piled high. It was cramped and sometimes uncomfortable, but there was a warmth to it that had nothing to do with temperature. They were becoming a family, not just in name, but in truth. Gideon found himself marveling at how quickly the girls had adapted to their new life. Mara, who had been so fierce and suspicious at first, had begun to soften around the edges. She still worked harder than anyone else and rarely complained, but she had started to laugh occasionally, small, surprised sounds, as if she was remembering how to be young. June had blossomed in the safety of the ranch, her natural nurturing instincts finding expression in the care she lavished on the animals. And Ellie. Ellie was simply Ellie, a force of nature wrapped in a 5-year-old body, spreading joy wherever she went like seeds from a dandelion. And Lydia. Gideon found himself thinking about Lydia more than he wanted to admit. The way she smiled when she thought no one was watching, the way her hair caught the firelight in the evenings, the way she touched his arm sometimes when she passed him, a gesture so natural and unconscious that it made his heart ache. He had married her to protect her. It had been a practical arrangement, nothing more. But somewhere along the way, he couldn't pinpoint exactly when, something had shifted. The wall he had built around his heart was crumbling, and in its place, something new was growing. Something that felt terrifyingly like love. He tried to push the feeling away. He told himself it was too soon, that he was still grieving Sarah, that Lydia deserved better than a broken man who spent half his nights fighting off nightmares. But the heart doesn't listen to logic. The heart wants what it wants, regardless of timing or propriety or fear. And Gideon's heart wanted Lydia. January brought a thaw, and with it, a visitor that no one expected. Gideon was repairing the chicken coop when he heard the sound of a wagon approaching. He set down his hammer and walked to the front of the house, his hand resting instinctively on the revolver at his hip. The wagon that came into view was modest but well-maintained, driven by an elderly man with a white beard and kind eyes. Beside him sat a woman of similar age, bundled in a heavy coat, her silver hair tucked beneath a bonnet. Gideon relaxed slightly. These were not Silas's men. "Afternoon," the old man called out as he brought the wagon to a stop. "I'm looking for Lydia Crane. Or Ward, I suppose it is now." "Who's asking?" The old man climbed down from the wagon with surprising agility for his age. "Name's Thomas Whitmore. This is my wife, Edith. We were friends of Nathan Crane, Lydia's husband. We heard she'd settled in these parts and wanted to pay our respects." Lydia must have heard the voices because she appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw the visitors, her face transformed. "Mr. Whitmore? Mrs. Whitmore?" She rushed down the porch steps and threw her arms around the old woman. "I can't believe it. How did you find us?" "Word travels," Thomas Whitmore said with a gentle smile. "We heard about what happened at the church on Thanksgiving Eve. The whole territory's been talking about it." His expression sobered. "We also heard about Silas, about what he's been doing." Lydia's face fell. "You know about that?" "We know more than you might think." The old man's eyes were grave. "That's partly why we're here. There are things you need to know, Lydia, things that might help you." They gathered around the table inside the cabin, the girls sent out to play in the yard under Mara's watchful eye. Gideon sat beside Lydia, close enough that their shoulders touched, a silent show of support. Thomas Whitmore cleared his throat. "Nathan was like a son to us. When he married Lydia and started his family, we watched him grow into one of the finest men we'd ever known. But we also watched Silas. We saw what he was becoming." "We all saw it," Edith added, her voice soft but steady. "The lies, the manipulation, the way he treated people, especially women." Lydia's hand found Gideon's under the table. He squeezed it gently. "Before Nathan died," Thomas continued, "he came to see us. He was worried about what would happen to his family if something happened to him. Worried about Silas." The old man reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. "He gave us this, made us promise to keep it safe, to give it to Lydia if the worst should happen." Lydia stared at the envelope. "What is it?" "Evidence." Thomas placed the envelope on the table. "Documentation of everything Silas has done over the years, forged documents, bribed officials, stolen money. There's even a sworn statement from a woman in Cripple Creek who says Silas—" He stopped, glancing at Lydia. "Well, it's ugly. The kind of ugly that could put a man in prison for a very long time." Lydia's hands were shaking as she picked up the envelope. "Why didn't he give this to me before?" "He was planning to," Edith said gently. "He told us he wanted to wait until he had enough evidence to be absolutely certain. He wanted to protect you and the girls from Silas's retaliation." Her eyes glistened with tears. "But then the fever took him. It happened so fast." "We should have come sooner," Thomas added, his voice heavy with regret. "When we heard you'd run, we tried to find you, but you'd disappeared. It wasn't until the news from Dusty Hollow reached us that we knew where you'd gone." Lydia opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were dozens of papers, letters, affidavits, bank records, all meticulously organized and labeled. As she leafed through them, her expression shifted from shock to disbelief to something that looked almost like hope. "This is everything," she breathed. "This is, Gideon, this is everything we need." Gideon leaned over to look at the documents. His eyes widened as he began to understand the scope of what Nathan had assembled. This wasn't just evidence. This was a complete case for the prosecution, enough to destroy Silas Crane legally, permanently, irrevocably. "Why didn't you go to the authorities yourselves?" he asked the Whitmores. Thomas shook his head. We're old. We don't have the resources or the connections to fight a man like Silas. And frankly, we were afraid. He met Gideon's eyes steadily. But you're not old, and from what I've heard, you're not afraid of much. He's afraid of losing us, Lydia said softly, and when Gideon looked at her, there was something in her eyes that made his heart stop. That's the only thing that scares him. The silence that followed was charged with meaning. Finally, Gideon spoke. We need to get this to the right people. The territorial marshal, maybe even federal authorities, given the scope of what's here. Agreed, Thomas said. But you'll need to be careful. Silas has spies everywhere. If he finds out what you have before you can deliver it, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone at the table understood what was at stake. I'll ride to Denver tomorrow, Gideon decided. I'll take the documents directly to the territorial marshal's office. That's the safest way. I'm coming with you, Lydia said immediately. No, it's too dangerous. If something happens, I want to be there. Her voice was fierce. These are my children we're fighting for, my husband's evidence, my battle. I won't sit here waiting while you risk your life. They stared at each other across the table, and Gideon saw in her eyes a determination that matched his own. She was not the frightened, exhausted woman who had appeared on his doorstep 2 months ago. She had found her strength again, and she was not going to back down. All right, he said finally, we'll go together, but the girls stay here, where it's safe. Who will protect them while we're gone? Lydia asked. It was Edith who answered. We will. Thomas and I can stay here until you return. We may be old, but Thomas still knows how to shoot, and I'm not entirely helpless myself. She smiled. Besides, I've been wanting to meet these granddaughters of Nathan's. He used to write us about them all the time. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. You'd do that? You'd stay? Of course we would. Edith reached across the table and took Lydia's hand. Nathan loved you more than anything in this world. The least we can do is help protect what he loved. The decision made, they spent the rest of the day preparing. Gideon checked and rechecked his weapons, loaded supplies into the wagon, and mapped out the fastest route to Denver. Lydia packed provisions and wrote a long letter to the girls explaining where she was going and why, to be opened only if she didn't return. That night, after the Whitmores had settled into the small guest room and the girls were asleep, Lydia found Gideon standing on the porch, staring out at the moonlit valley. You should be resting, she said, coming to stand beside him. We have a long journey tomorrow. I know, I couldn't sleep. Nightmares? He shook his head. No, just thinking. About what? Gideon was quiet for a long moment. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light across the snow-covered fields. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the darkness. About how much has changed, he finally said. 2 months ago I was alone. I thought I'd be alone forever. I'd made peace with it. Or at least, I thought I had. He turned to look at her. And then you knocked on my door. Lydia smiled. Technically, it was Ellie who knocked. She's always been the brave one. Wonder where she gets that from. The compliment hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Gideon, Lydia said softly, can I ask you something? Anything. When you married me, when you offered to protect us, was it just because of the girls? Just because you wanted to save them? Gideon's heart began to pound. He knew what she was really asking. He knew what his answer would mean. At first, he admitted, at first it was about the girls. About giving them a home, a father, a chance at a normal life. He paused, struggling to find the right words. But it stopped being just about them a long time ago. Lydia's breath caught. What do you mean? Gideon turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, she was beautiful. Not just pretty, but truly beautiful, with a strength and grace that took his breath away. He thought of Sarah, of the love they had shared, of the grief that had consumed him after her death. He thought he would never feel that way again. He thought that part of him had died with his family. But here, standing on this porch with this woman, he realized he had been wrong. I mean that somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a responsibility and started seeing you as... He stopped, his voice catching. As something else. Someone else. Someone you what? The question was barely a whisper. Gideon reached out and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears that were starting to fall down her cheeks.
Someone I love, he said. I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. I know 100 reasons why this is crazy. But I love you, Lydia. Not because I feel obligated. Not because I'm trying to replace what I lost. But because you are brave and kind and strong and beautiful. And every day I spend with you makes me want to spend another one. Lydia was crying openly now, but she was smiling too. A radiant, trembling smile that lit up her face like sunrise. I love you too, she whispered. I've been trying not to. I've been telling myself it's too fast, that I'm still grieving Nathan, that I should be grateful for what you've given us without wanting more. She laughed shakily. But my heart doesn't listen to logic. Neither does mine. They stood there in the moonlight, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, and then, slowly, tenderly, Gideon kissed her. It was different from the kiss at their wedding. That had been a formality, a seal on a contract. This was something else entirely. This was a promise, a beginning, a declaration that whatever came next, they would face it together. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Well, Lydia said, a hint of her old humor returning, I suppose this means our marriage of convenience has become something else. I suppose it has, Gideon smiled, a real smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Any regrets? Not a single one. They went inside together, hand in hand, and for the first time since they'd met, they shared the bed as husband and wife, not just in name, but in heart. The journey to Denver took 3 days. They traveled through snow and ice and bitter cold, stopping at roadside inns when they could find them and camping in the wagon when they couldn't. Gideon kept the documents hidden in a false bottom he'd built into the wagon bed, covered with supplies and blankets. They took turns keeping watch at night, never both sleeping at the same time. On the second day they were followed. Gideon spotted the riders first, 2 men on horseback, keeping their distance but never falling too far behind. They made no move to approach, but their presence was unmistakable. Silas's men? Lydia asked, her voice tight. Probably. Gideon's hand rested on the rifle beside him. He must have found out we left. What do we do? Keep moving. We're only a day from Denver. Once we reach the marshal's office, we'll be safe. But the riders were closing the gap. By late afternoon, they had cut the distance in half, and as the sun began to set, Gideon made a decision. There's a way station about 2 miles ahead, he said. We'll stop there for the night. Lots of people around. They won't try anything in public. The way station was a sprawling complex of buildings. A general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel, and a saloon that seemed to be doing brisk business despite the cold. Gideon pulled the wagon into the stable yard and helped Lydia down. Get us a room, he said quietly. I'll take care of the horses and bring the documents inside. Lydia nodded and hurried toward the hotel. Gideon unhitched the horses with practiced efficiency, keeping one eye on the road behind them. The 2 riders appeared just as he was finishing. They rode into the stable yard slowly, making no attempt to hide their presence. One was tall and lean, with a face like a hatchet. The other was shorter and stockier, with small, mean eyes that reminded Gideon of a snake. Evening, the tall one said, his voice deceptively casual. Nice night for a ride. Gideon straightened up, his hand resting on his revolver. Can I help you, gentlemen? Maybe. The tall man dismounted, his movements deliberate. We're looking for someone. A woman. Dark hair, about ya high. He held up his hand. Traveling with a man who fits your description. A lot of women fit that description. True. But this one's special. The man smiled, revealing a mouthful of crooked teeth. She's got something that belongs to our employer, something very valuable. He'd like it back. Gideon's blood ran cold, but his expression didn't change. I don't know what you're talking about. No? The man took a step closer. Then I suppose you won't mind if we take a look at your wagon, just to make sure. I do mind, actually. Gideon's hand tightened on his revolver. This is my property. You have no right to search it. Rights. The shorter man laughed. That's cute. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the tall man shrugged. All right. Have it your way. We'll just wait here. See what happens in the morning. He smiled that crooked smile again. Roads can be dangerous this time of year.
Accidents happen. They tied their horses to the hitching post and walked toward the saloon, their laughter echoing in the cold night air. Gideon waited until they were inside, then quickly retrieved the documents from the wagon's hidden compartment. He couldn't leave them in the stable. Not with those men around. He would have to keep them close. He found Lydia in the room she'd secured, pacing nervously by the window. "I saw them," she said as soon as he entered. "Silas's men. They found us. They know about the documents." Gideon locked the door behind him and set the envelope on the bed.
But they don't have them. Not yet. What do we do? Gideon crossed to the window and looked out at the stable yard below. The saloon was lit up, music and laughter spilling out into the night. The two riders were probably inside, drinking and watching, waiting for their moment. "We leave before dawn," he said. "There's a back trail that leads around the main road. It'll add a few hours to the journey, but it might throw them off." "And if it doesn't?" Gideon turned to face her. "Then we fight." Lydia's face was pale, but her voice was steady. "I can shoot. Nathan taught me years ago." "Good, because before this is over, you might have to." They didn't sleep that night. They sat together in the darkness, talking in hushed voices, the documents between them like a talisman against the evil that waited outside. Lydia told him more about Nathan, about how they'd met, how they'd fallen in love, about the early years of their marriage when everything seemed possible. She told him about the births of each of her daughters, about the joy and the terror and the overwhelming love she'd felt when she first held them in her arms. She told him about Nathan's death, about holding his hand as the fever took him, about the last words he'd spoken, about the promise she'd made to protect their children no matter what. And Gideon told her about Sarah. He'd never talked about her like this. Not to anyone, not since the flood. But here, in this small room with danger waiting outside, the words came pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. He told her about meeting Sarah at a church social when they were both barely 18, about the way she'd laughed at his clumsy attempts at flirtation, about their wedding day when she'd looked so beautiful in her white dress that he'd actually forgotten his vows, about the birth of Thomas, who had come screaming into the world like he was angry at being born, about Samuel, who had been so quiet and peaceful that they'd worried something was wrong. He told her about the flood, about the sound of the water coming, like a freight train in the darkness, about waking Sarah, grabbing the boys, running for higher ground, about the moment when the current had swept them away, one by one, despite everything he'd tried to do, about standing alone in the mud afterward, surrounded by the debris of everything he'd loved. By the time he finished, they were both crying, quiet tears that fell unchecked in the darkness. "I'm so sorry," Lydia whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything you lost." Gideon shook his head. "I spent 6 years blaming myself. 6 years believing that if I'd just been faster, stronger, smarter, I could have saved them." He looked at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But I couldn't. I did everything I could, and it wasn't enough. And I've had to learn to live with that." "Have you? Learned to live with it?" He thought about the question for a long moment. "I'm learning," he said finally. "Every day I'm learning a little more. And you and the girls, you've taught me something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That the best way to honor the dead is to keep living, to keep loving, to keep fighting for the people you have, instead of drowning in grief for the people you've lost." He reached out and took her hand. "Sarah would have loved you. She would have loved the girls. And she would have wanted me to be happy." Lydia squeezed his hand. "I think Nathan would have felt the same way. He always wanted me to find joy again, even after he was gone." She smiled through her tears. "I think our departed spouses would have approved of each other." "I think they would have." They sat in silence for a moment, their grief mingling with something that felt almost like peace. Then Gideon straightened up. "We should go. It'll be dawn soon." They gathered their things quickly and quietly. Gideon checked his weapons one last time, the rifle, the revolver, the knife tucked into his boot. Lydia had a small derringer that she'd hidden in her dress, a gift from Nathan that she'd never told Silas about. They slipped out of the hotel through a back door and made their way to the stable. The world was still dark, but there was a lightening on the eastern horizon that promised sunrise.
The air was bitter cold, their breath fogging in the darkness. They had almost reached the wagon when a voice stopped them. "Going somewhere?" The tall man stepped out of the shadows, his rifle leveled at Gideon's chest. Behind him, the shorter man emerged from behind a post, his pistol aimed at Lydia. "We've been waiting," the tall man said. "Figured you might try to sneak out early. Silas said you were clever." Gideon's mind raced. The documents were in the bag at his side. If these men got them, everything would be lost. But if he went for his gun, they'd shoot him before he could draw. "There's no need for anyone to get hurt," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Just let us pass and—" "Can't do that." The tall man shook his head. "See, Silas is paying us a lot of money to bring back those papers, and he made it clear that he doesn't care how we do it." He smiled. "Though I have to say, it'd be a shame to damage the merchandise. That's a fine-looking woman you've got there." Something snapped in Gideon. Everything that happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. He dove to the side just as the tall man fired, the bullet whizzing past his ear. His hand found his revolver, drew it, fired, all in one smooth motion. The shorter man screamed and went down, clutching his shoulder. The tall man cursed and swung his rifle toward Gideon, but before he could fire, there was another shot, this one from Lydia's derringer. The tall man staggered, a look of surprise on his face, and crumpled to the ground. Silence. Gideon stood slowly, his ears ringing, his heart pounding. The shorter man was crawling away, whimpering. The tall man wasn't moving at all. Lydia was standing with the derringer still raised, her face white as chalk. "I killed him," she whispered. "I killed him." Gideon crossed to her and gently lowered her arm. "You saved us. You saved both of us." I've never... I know." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as her body shook. "I know, it's over now. It's over." But it wasn't over. Not yet. They left the shorter man tied to a fence post for the authorities to find and pushed on toward Denver, driving the horses harder than they should have. The sun rose behind them, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. And by midday, they saw the city in the distance. Denver was larger than Gideon had expected, a sprawling maze of buildings and streets, crowded with people and horses and wagons. They made their way through the chaos to the territorial marshal's office, a squat stone building near the center of town. The marshal was a grizzled man named Harrison, with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He listened without interruption as Gideon and Lydia told their story, occasionally glancing at the documents they'd spread across his desk. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is quite a tale," he said finally, "and quite a collection of evidence." "Is it enough?" Lydia asked, her voice tight. "Is it enough to stop him?" Marshal Harrison picked up one of the affidavits and studied it. "This is more than enough. Hell, this is enough to put Silas Crane away for the rest of his natural life." He looked up at them, his expression grim. "I'll send deputies to arrest him immediately. He'll be in custody within the week." Lydia let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for months. Tears began to stream down her face, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Marshal Harrison nodded. "Thank your husband for collecting all this, and thank yourselves for having the courage to bring it to me." He stood and extended his hand to Gideon. "You're a brave man, Mr. Ward. Not many would have done what you did for a family that wasn't even theirs." Gideon shook the marshal's hand. "They are mine," he said quietly, "in every way that matters." The journey home felt different. The threat that had been hanging over them for so long was finally lifting. Silas would be arrested, tried, and imprisoned. The girls would be safe. Lydia would be free. They traveled slowly this time, stopping at comfortable inns, eating hot meals, talking and laughing and planning for the future. They talked about improvements they wanted to make to the ranch, about education for the girls, about the possibilities, distant but real, of adding to their family someday. By the time they crested the final hill and saw the cabin in the valley below, Gideon felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he was coming home. The girls must have been watching for them because they came running out before the wagon had even stopped. Ellie first, her new doll bouncing in her arms, followed by June and then Mara, who was trying very hard to look dignified and failing completely. "Mama, Papa Gideon!" Ellie threw herself at Lydia as she climbed down from the wagon. "You came back! I knew you'd come back!" "Of course we came back," Lydia said, scooping her up and holding her tight. "We'll always come back." June wrapped her arms around Gideon's waist, and even Mara allowed herself to be pulled into a hug. The Whitmores stood on the porch, beaming, looking like proud grandparents at a family reunion. "Is it over?" Mara asked, her voice small. "Is Silas really going to be stopped?" Gideon looked down at her, at this fierce, frightened, impossibly brave young woman who had been carrying the weight of her family's survival for far too long. "It's over," he said. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Mara stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, the tension that had been holding her body rigid for months began to drain away. Her shoulders dropped, her jaw unclenched, and for the first time since Gideon had met her, she looked like what she was, a 12-year-old girl who just wanted to be safe. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." That night, they had a celebration. The Whitmores had prepared a feast: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, apple pie. The cabin was warm and filled with laughter, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth. The girls chattered excitedly about everything that had happened while their parents were gone, each story more elaborate than the last. After dinner, when the dishes had been cleared and the younger girls had begun to yawn, Gideon stood up from the table. "I have something to say." Everyone fell quiet, looking at him expectantly. Gideon cleared his throat. He was not a man given to speeches, but this moment called for one. 2 months ago, I was alone. I had been alone for 6 years, and I expected to be alone for the rest of my life. I had convinced myself that I didn't need anyone, that I was better off by myself, that the safest thing I could do was keep everyone at arm's length. He looked at Lydia, at the girls, at the Whitmores. I was wrong. I was so wrong. And I'm grateful every day that a knock on my door showed me just how wrong I was. Lydia's eyes were glistening. Even Mara looked moved. This family has given me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to keep going. A reason to hope. A reason to believe that even after the worst thing imaginable happens, there can still be good in the world. He paused, his throat tight. I love you. All of you. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me. Ellie broke the silence that followed. Does this mean you're really our papa now? She asked. Not just pretend papa? Gideon knelt down so he was at her eye level. This means I'm really your papa now, he said, for as long as you'll have me. Forever? Forever? Ellie threw her arms around his neck. I love you, Papa Gideon. I love you too, Ellie. He held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her small body against his chest. I love you too. The night deepened around the cabin, wrapping it in darkness and silence. But inside, the light burned bright, and the warmth of a family newly forged against all odds filled every corner. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the vast dark sky, indifferent to the joys and sorrows of the people below. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of snow and pine and the promise of a new day. And in the cabin in the valley, 5 hearts beat together in rhythm, bound by something stronger than blood, something more enduring than time. Love. The weeks that followed their return from Denver passed in a blur of quiet transformation. The shadow of Silas Crane, which had loomed over the family like a thundercloud since that first desperate knock on Gideon's door, began to lift. Word came from Marshal Harrison that Silas had been arrested without incident, found drunk in a saloon in Redwater County, too intoxicated to even resist when the deputies put him in chains. The evidence Nathan had gathered was more than sufficient. The trial would be swift, the outcome certain. For the first time in months, Lydia slept through the night without waking in a cold sweat. The Whitmores stayed for another week before departing, promising to return for a proper visit in the spring. Their presence had been a balm to Lydia, a connection to her old life that reminded her she hadn't lost everything when Nathan died. Thomas Whitmore had spent hours with Gideon, sharing stories about Nathan that made Lydia laugh and cry in equal measure. Edith had doted on the girls, teaching them to knit and bake and telling them tales of their father as a young man. When the wagon finally pulled away, Ellie waved until it disappeared over the horizon, then turned to Gideon with a thoughtful expression. "Are they our grandparents now?" she asked. Gideon considered the question. "I think they'd like to be, if you want them to." "I want them to be." Ellie nodded decisively. "Everyone should have grandparents, and they're nice." "Then they're your grandparents." Ellie beamed and skipped back to the cabin where June was waiting with a cup of hot cocoa. Gideon watched her go, marveling at how easily children could adapt to change, how naturally they absorbed new people into their hearts. He envied them that sometimes. February brought a deep freeze that kept them all inside for days at a stretch. The cabin, which had once felt cavernous and empty, now seemed almost too small for 5 people. They learned to navigate around each other, to find their own spaces within the shared whole. Mara claimed a corner near the window where she could read by natural light. June took over the area near the fireplace, where she could tend to the fire and keep an eye on the stew pot. Ellie was everywhere at once, a perpetual motion machine that somehow never ran out of energy. And Lydia and Gideon found their own rhythm too. They had shared the bed since their return from Denver, but the intimacy between them was still new, still tentative. They were learning each other, the way Lydia curled toward him in her sleep, seeking warmth, the way Gideon sometimes woke before dawn and lay still, listening to her breathe, afraid to move for fear of disturbing the fragile peace, the way they both reached for each other in the darkness, 2 people who had lost everything finding something unexpected in each other's arms. One night, when the wind was howling outside and the fire was burning low, Lydia propped herself up on one elbow and looked at Gideon in the dim light. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything." "Do you ever think about them? Your wife and sons?" It was a question she had never asked directly before, though he knew she must have wondered. He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Every day," he said finally, "but it's different now. It used to be like a wound that never healed. Every thought of them was pain, raw and immediate. Now it's more like," he struggled for the right word, "like a scar. The pain is still there, underneath, but it's not the only thing anymore. It's part of me, but it doesn't define me." Lydia nodded slowly. "I understand that. Nathan, when I first lost him, I couldn't even say his name without falling apart. But now I can talk about him with the girls, share memories, laugh at the funny things he used to do. The grief is still there, but there's room for other things too." "Room for joy," Gideon said quietly. "Room for joy," she agreed. "Room for love." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his stubbled cheek. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. After Nathan died, after everything with Silas, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd spend the rest of my days just surviving, just trying to keep my girls safe. And now I think about the future." Her voice was soft, wondering. "I make plans. I imagine what things will be like a year from now, 5 years from now. I didn't realize how much I'd stopped doing that until I started again." Gideon pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "The future," he murmured. "I like the sound of that." They lay together in the darkness, the wind singing its cold song outside, and for the first time in a long time, both of them dreamed of things to come instead of things that had been lost. March came with the first hints of spring, longer days, milder temperatures, the occasional glimpse of green pushing up through the melting snow. The ranch, which had been dormant all winter, began to stir back to life. There were fences to mend, fields to prepare, animals to tend. Gideon threw himself into the work with renewed energy, and to his surprise, he found eager helpers at every turn. Mara had become his shadow, following him everywhere, asking questions, learning everything she could about running a ranch. She had a natural aptitude for the work, a sharp mind and a willingness to push through difficulty that reminded Gideon of himself at that age. He started teaching her more complex skills, how to read the weather, how to track animals, how to negotiate with suppliers in town. "You're a natural," he told her one afternoon, watching as she expertly guided a stubborn calf back into its pen. "Your father would be proud." Mara's face flushed with pleasure, but she tried to hide it behind her usual mask of stoicism. "He taught me some things, before he got sick," What kinds of things? How to ride, how to shoot. She paused. How to protect my sisters. Gideon nodded. He taught you well. But you don't have to carry that burden alone anymore. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, she said, I know. It's just hard to let go. For so long, I was the only one standing between them and danger. I was the one who had to be strong, who couldn't show fear, who had to make decisions no 12-year-old should have to make. Her voice caught. I don't know how to be just a kid again. Gideon crouched down so he was at her eye level. You don't have to figure it all out at once. It's okay to still want to protect them. That's what big sisters do. But it's also okay to let yourself be protected, to let yourself be a child. He put a hand on her shoulder. You've earned the right to be taken care of, Mara. You've more than earned it. Mara's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She was still too proud for that, or perhaps too afraid that if she started, she wouldn't be able to stop. I'll try, she said finally. I'll try to let go. That's all I ask. June, meanwhile, had found her calling in the barn. The animals had become her domain. She fed them, groomed them, talked to them in the soft, soothing voice that seemed to calm even the most skittish creatures. Gideon had given her official responsibility for the chickens, and she had thrown herself into the task with dedication that bordered on obsession. The brown hen is laying more than the others, she reported one morning over breakfast. I think it's because I've been giving her extra grain, and the rooster has stopped pecking at the gray hen since I moved his perch to the other side of the coop. You've been studying them, Lydia observed, amused. They're interesting. June's face was earnest. They all have different personalities, just like people. The brown hen is bossy, the gray one is shy. The speckled one is curious, and she always wants to see what I'm doing. Sounds like you've got a gift, Gideon said. Some people have a way with animals. You might be one of them. June ducked her head, pleased. I just like taking care of things, making sure they're happy and healthy. That's a good quality to have. Gideon reached over and ruffled her hair. Don't ever lose it. And Ellie was simply Ellie. She had adopted Solomon, Gideon's old horse, as her personal project. Every morning she insisted on visiting him in the stable, bringing him apple slices and chattering away about her dreams and her dolls and whatever else came into her 5-year-old mind. Solomon, who had always been a dignified and somewhat aloof animal, had somehow become putty in her tiny hands. He understands me, Ellie insisted when Gideon expressed amazement at the transformation. We're friends. I can see that. Can I learn to ride him? Really ride him, not just sit on his back while you lead him around? Gideon considered. Solomon was old and gentle, but he was also large. Much too large for a child Ellie's size to handle alone. Tell you what, he said. When you're a little bigger, I'll teach you to ride properly. But for now, how about we work on grooming? You can learn to brush him, clean his hooves, braid his mane. That way, when you're ready to ride, you'll already know how to take care of him. Ellie's face lit up. Really? You'll teach me? I'll teach you everything I know. Promise? Promise. Ellie threw her arms around his legs, squeezing tight. You're the best papa in the whole world. Gideon's heart swelled. He still wasn't used to being called that. Wasn't sure he would ever be used to it. But every time he heard it, the walls around his heart crumbled a little more. I try, he said, his voice thick. I try. The first real test of their new family came in late March, when a late-season blizzard swept down from the mountains with almost no warning. One moment the sky was clear and blue, the next it was a wall of white, the wind howling like a wounded animal, the temperature plummeting so fast it seemed impossible. Gideon was in the far pasture when the storm hit, checking on a section of fence that had been giving him trouble. He had minutes, maybe less, before visibility dropped to nothing and the cold became deadly. He ran. The cabin was a quarter-mile away, but in the driving snow, it might as well have been 100 miles. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. The wind tore at his clothes, stealing the warmth from his body. His legs felt like lead, his lungs burning with every frozen breath. Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. He stumbled, went down on one knee, forced himself back up. The cold was seeping into his bones, making his thoughts slow and sluggish. He knew the signs of hypothermia. the confusion, the overwhelming desire to just lie down and rest. He fought against it with everything he had. And then, through the swirling white, he saw a light, a lantern swinging in the darkness, a figure trudging toward him through the snow. Mara. "Papa Gideon!" Her voice was almost lost in the wind. "Papa Gideon, this way!" He stumbled toward her, and she grabbed his arm, pulling him forward with a strength that belied her 12-year-old frame. Together they fought through the last 100 yards to the cabin, where Lydia was waiting with the door open and a blanket ready. "Get him by the fire," she ordered, her voice calm despite the fear in her eyes. "June, heat some water. Ellie, bring more blankets." They worked as a team, stripping off his frozen clothes, wrapping him in warmth, pressing hot stones against his chest and feet. Gideon drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of their voices but unable to respond. "Is he going to be okay?" Ellie's voice, high and frightened. "Mama, is Papa Gideon going to be okay?" "He's going to be fine, sweetheart. He just needs to warm up." "He's so cold. He's shivering." "Shivering is good. It means his body is fighting." Hours passed. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the cabin, the fire roared and the family kept vigil. Lydia sat beside Gideon, holding his hand, talking to him in a low, steady voice. "You stay with us, you hear me? You don't get to leave. Not now. Not after everything we've been through." Her voice cracked. "I can't lose you, Gideon. I can't lose anyone else." And somewhere in the fog of cold and exhaustion, Gideon heard her. He felt her hand in his, warm and strong. He felt the weight of the blankets, the heat of the fire, the presence of the girls gathered around him like guardian angels. He fought his way back. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Ellie's face, hovering inches from his own. "He's awake!" she shrieked. "Mama, he's awake!" Lydia was there in an instant, her face streaked with tears. "Gideon, can you hear me?" "I hear you," he croaked. His voice sounded like sandpaper. "Don't you ever do that again." She was crying and laughing at the same time. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." "I'll try not to." He managed a weak smile. "Though I make no promises about the weather." Mara appeared at the edge of his vision, her face pale and drawn. "I saw you through the window," she said quietly. "I saw you fall. I grabbed the lantern and went out before Mama could stop me. You saved my life." Mara shook her head. "You would have found your way back. You're too stubborn to die in a snowstorm." "Maybe, but you made sure I didn't have to." Gideon reached out and took her hand. "Thank you, Mara. Thank you for coming for me." For a moment, Mara's composure cracked. Her lip trembled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "I couldn't let you die," she whispered. "You're my papa now. I couldn't let you die." It was the first time she had called him that without the addition of his name. Not Papa Gideon, just Papa. Something shifted in the air between them. A final barrier falling, a last wall crumbling. Mara threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his chest, and Gideon held her tight, his own tears falling into her dark hair. "I'm here," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise." The blizzard lasted 2 more days. They were trapped in the cabin, the 5 of them, with nothing to do but wait out the storm. It should have been miserable. The close quarters, the limited supplies, the constant howl of the wind. But somehow, it became something else entirely. It became a gift. They told stories around the fire, tales of the old country, of the frontier, of adventures real and imagined. Lydia taught the girls to play card games Nathan had taught her. Gideon showed them how to whittle, how to make simple toys from scraps of wood. They sang songs, some familiar and some made up on the spot, their voices mingling with the crackle of the flames. And they talked. They talked about everything, about their fears and their hopes, their memories and their dreams. They talked about the people they had lost and the people they had found. They talked about what it meant to be a family, not just by blood, but by choice. On the second night of the storm, when the fire was burning low and the girls were half asleep in a pile of blankets, Ellie looked up at Gideon with drowsy eyes. "Papa," she said, "do you think we'll always be together, forever and ever?" Gideon looked at Lydia, who was watching them with a soft smile. He looked at June, curled up with her head on Mara's shoulder. He looked at Mara, whose face was peaceful in sleep for the first time since he'd known her. "Forever and ever," he said. "That's a promise." Ellie smiled and closed her eyes, and within moments she was asleep. Lydia reached over and took his hand. "Forever and ever," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." They sat together in the firelight, listening to the storm rage outside, feeling the warmth of their family around them. And for the first time in a very long time, both of them felt truly at peace. The spring that followed was one of the most beautiful anyone could remember. The snow melted, the flowers bloomed, and the world came alive with color and sound. The ranch thrived under Gideon's care, the herd growing, the fields producing, the land yielding its bounty. The girls grew too, taller, stronger, more confident with each passing day. Word came in April that Silas Crane had been convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. The judge had been unmoved by his pleas for leniency, citing the overwhelming evidence of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy. He would die behind bars, an old man forgotten by the world. When Lydia heard the news, she wept. "It's over," she said, clutching the letter in her hands. "It's really, truly over." Gideon held her while she cried, tears of relief and release that had been building for years. The nightmare that had begun with Nathan's death was finally at an end. "What do we do now?" she asked when the tears had subsided. "What happens next?" "Now we live," Gideon said simply. "We plant crops and raise animals and watch our girls grow up. We build a life together, day by day, year by year. We love each other and we take care of each other and we face whatever comes together." Lydia looked up at him, her eyes red but her smile radiant. "That sounds perfect," she said. "That sounds absolutely perfect." The summer brought new challenges and new joys. There were crops to tend and animals to manage, fences to repair, and buildings to maintain. The work was hard, but it was good work. Honest work that left them tired at the end of each day, but satisfied in a way that nothing else could match. The girls flourished. Mara had taken over management of the cattle, riding out each morning to check on the herd with a competence that amazed everyone who saw her. She had grown 3 inches since arriving at the ranch and had started to look less like a child and more like the young woman she was becoming. June had expanded her domain from the chicken coop to the entire barn, taking responsibility for all the animals with a dedication that bordered on obsession. She had started keeping detailed records of each creature, their health, their habits, their needs, and had already identified several improvements that could be made to their care. And Ellie had become the unofficial mascot of the ranch, known throughout the valley for her boundless energy and infectious enthusiasm. She had finally convinced Gideon to let her start riding lessons, and she took to the saddle with a natural grace that suggested she would one day be as skilled a horsewoman as her older sister. But it was the quiet moments that Gideon treasured most. The evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, while Lydia leaned against his shoulder. The mornings in the barn, teaching Ellie to brush Solomon's coat while she chattered about her dreams. The afternoons in the fields, working alongside Mara and feeling the bond between them deepen with each passing day. "This is what I was meant for," he thought one evening, looking out at the ranch he had built and the family he had found. "This is what I was saved for." It was a thought he never could have imagined having 6 months ago. 6 months ago, he had been a shell of a man, going through the motions of life without really living. 6 months ago, he had believed that he would die alone, that the best part of his life was behind him, that there was nothing left but waiting for the end. How wrong he had been. One warm evening in late August, Lydia found him standing by the graves on the hill behind the cabin. He had planted flowers there in the spring, wildflowers that Sarah had loved, the kind that Samuel used to pick in fistfuls and bring to his mother. They were blooming now, a riot of color against the green grass. "I wondered where you'd gone," Lydia said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Just visiting," Gideon replied. "I try to come up here when I can, to talk to them, to let them know how things are going." Lydia nodded. She had never asked to come to the graves before, respecting the privacy of his grief. But now, standing beside him, she felt like she understood. "Would you introduce me?" she asked. Gideon looked at her, surprised. "You want to meet them?" "They're part of you, part of who you are." She slipped her hand into his. "I'd like to know them." As much as I can. Gideon's throat tightened, but he nodded. Sarah, he said, his voice rough. This is Lydia, my wife. The word still felt strange, even after all these months. She's wonderful, kind and strong and brave. I think you would have liked her. Lydia squeezed his hand. And these are Thomas and Samuel. My boys. He gestured to the two smaller headstones. Thomas was 10 when it happened. He was smart and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. Samuel was 7. He was quieter, more thoughtful. He loved animals, especially horses. He paused, struggling to continue. I miss them every day, he said finally. I'll always miss them, but I've found a way to keep living, to keep loving. He looked at Lydia. Because of her. Because of the girls. They gave me something to live for again. Lydia was crying softly, but she was smiling too. It's nice to meet you, she said to the headstones. All of you. I promise I'll take good care of him. They stood there together in the fading light, the living and the memory of the dead, united by love and loss and the strange, beautiful journey that had brought them to this moment. Do you think they approve? Lydia asked as they walked back to the cabin. Gideon considered the question. He thought about Sarah, her warmth, her generosity, her absolute conviction that love was the most important thing in the world. He thought about his boys, their laughter, their energy, their boundless capacity for joy. I think they do, he said finally. I think they're happy that I found you. I hope so. I know so. Fall came with its usual blaze of color, the trees on the mountainsides turning gold and crimson and orange. It was Gideon's favorite season, the time of harvest and preparation, of gathering in the fruits of the summer's labor and readying for the winter ahead. But this fall was different. This fall, there was a celebration to plan. It had been Ellie's idea, surprisingly enough. She had noticed that they had never had a proper wedding reception. The ceremony at the church had been rushed and desperate, focused on protection rather than celebration. And now that the danger was past, now that they were truly a family, she thought they ought to have a party. A big party, she insisted, with cake and dancing and everyone from town. Because you're married, and married people are supposed to have parties. Lydia had laughed and tried to explain that they didn't need a party, that what mattered was that they were together. But Ellie was not to be deterred. You need a party, she said firmly. Everyone needs to see how happy we are. And I want cake. And so, because no one could refuse Ellie anything, they planned a party. It was held on a crisp October afternoon, exactly 1 year after that first desperate knock on Gideon's door. The cabin and barn were decorated with ribbons and wildflowers. Tables were set up in the yard laden with food and drink. Musicians from town had been hired to play, and the sound of fiddles and guitars filled the air. Everyone came. The shopkeeper and his wife, the blacksmith, the women from the boarding house, the sheriff, who had become a good friend, the reverend, who had married them in such haste and was delighted to see how things had turned out. Neighbors from all over the valley, many of whom Gideon had barely spoken to in 6 years, came to offer their congratulations and well wishes. And the Whitmores, true to their promise, had returned for the occasion. I've never seen you look so happy, Edith said to Lydia as they watched the girls dance in the yard. It suits you. Lydia smiled. I am happy, happier than I ever thought I could be again. Nathan would be proud of all of you. I like to think so. Across the yard, Gideon was talking to Thomas Whitmore, but his eyes kept drifting to his family. To Mara, who was actually dancing with a boy from town and blushing furiously. To June, who was explaining something about chickens to a fascinated audience. To Ellie, who was spinning in circles until she got dizzy and fell down laughing. To Lydia, who caught his eye and smiled. You're a lucky man, Thomas observed. I know. I wasn't sure when I first heard what you'd done. Marrying a stranger to protect her from a man like Silas. It seemed foolish. Reckless. The old man shook his head. But I was wrong. Sometimes the foolish thing and the right thing are the same thing. I didn't feel foolish, Gideon said. I felt necessary. Like this was what I was supposed to do, what I was being called to do. And now? Gideon watched as Ellie dragged Lydia onto the makeshift dance floor, both of them laughing as they tried to follow the music. Mara had stopped dancing and was watching them with a soft smile. June had abandoned her chicken lecture and joined in, pulling a reluctant Mara with her. "Now I feel grateful," he said. "Every single day, I feel grateful." The party lasted until well after dark. The musicians played until their fingers ached, and still people called for more. The food disappeared, the drink flowed, and the laughter echoed across the valley like a blessing. Finally, as the moon rose and the stars came out, the guests began to drift away. They left with handshakes and hugs, with promises to visit again soon, with warm words and warmer wishes. And at last, the family was alone. They stood together in the yard, surrounded by the debris of celebration, looking up at the vast dark sky. "That was wonderful," Lydia said softly. "Thank you, all of you." "It was Ellie's idea," Mara pointed out. "I know, and it was a good one." Lydia scooped up her youngest daughter and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You were right. We needed a party." Ellie yawned hugely. "Can we have another one next year?" "We can have one every year. Promise?" "Promise." They went inside together, the five of them, leaving the moonlight and the stars behind. The cabin was warm and welcoming, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the smell of wood smoke and autumn in the air. Home. As Lydia tucked the girls into bed, Gideon stood by the window, looking out at the night. He thought about everything that had happened. The knock on the door, the desperate woman and her 3 starving children, the choices he had made and the life they had built together. A year ago, he had been dying. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. He had been a ghost haunting his own life, going through the motions without purpose or meaning. He had been waiting for death without having the courage to seek it out. And then Lydia had appeared, and everything had changed. He heard her footsteps behind him and turned. She was smiling, that soft, radiant smile that made his heart ache. "The girls are asleep," she said. "Ellie was out before I finished the first verse of her lullaby. It was a big day." It was. She came to stand beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything. Nothing." He pulled her close. "How lucky I am." We're both lucky." "We are." They stood together in the window, looking out at the moonlit valley. The ranch stretched before them, peaceful and prosperous, a testament to hard work and hope. The mountains rose in the distance, eternal and unchanging. And somewhere out there, in the vast dark sky, the stars burned on, indifferent to the joys and sorrows of the people below. But they weren't indifferent. Not really. Gideon believed that now. He believed that somewhere up there, Sarah and Thomas and Samuel were watching. He believed they had sent Lydia and the girls to him, had guided them to his door on that desperate Thanksgiving Eve. He believed they were happy. Happy that he had found love again. Happy that he had found a reason to live. "I love you," he said softly. Lydia looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I love you too." "Forever and ever?" She smiled. "Forever and ever." They kissed, soft and sweet, a promise and a beginning. And outside the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn and the memory of summer, the echo of laughter and the promise of joy to come. In the cabin in the valley, a family slept peacefully, bound by love and choice and the strange, beautiful twists of fate that had brought them together. They had faced darkness and come through to the light. They had lost everything and found something new, and tomorrow the sun would rise on another day, another chance to build, to grow, to love, another chance to live. The second winter on the ranch was gentler than the first. The snows came later and melted sooner, as if nature itself had decided to grant them a reprieve. Gideon took it as a sign, not of luck, but of rhythm. Everything in life had its seasons, its cycles of hardship and ease. They had weathered the storm. Now it was time to grow. The cabin had become too small for 5 people, a fact that had been obvious for months but which they had all politely ignored. Gideon had been planning an expansion since the summer, sketching designs on scraps of paper, calculating lumber and labor and cost. But it wasn't until the first frost of November that he finally gathered the family around the table and spread out his plans. "I want to build an addition," he announced. 2 more bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a sitting room. The girls deserve their own space, and we could all use a little more room to breathe. The girls leaned over the sketches, their eyes wide with wonder.
Our own rooms? June asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Really? Really? If you want them. I want one. Ellie bounced in her seat. I want a room with a window where I can see Solomon in the pasture, and I want shelves for all my dolls. Mara was quieter, studying the plans with a critical eye. This is a lot of work. Can we afford it? It was a practical question, the kind of question Mara always asked. She had never quite lost the wariness that came from months of running and hiding, the constant calculation of resources and risks. But there was something else in her voice now, too, something that sounded almost like hope. We can afford it, Gideon assured her. The ranch had a good year. The cattle sold well, the crops came in strong, and I've been putting money aside for something like this. But you'll need help, Mara pressed. You can't build it all yourself. No, I can't. That's why I've already talked to some of the neighbors.
Jim Patterson is a carpenter. He's agreed to help with the framing. Tom Wheeler has a team of draft horses we can use to haul lumber. And the Whitmore's son, Daniel, is coming out from Denver to lend a hand. Daniel's coming? Lydia looked up, surprised. I didn't know that. I wrote to them last month. He's been wanting to learn ranching, and his parents thought some time in the country would do him good. Gideon smiled. Besides, it'll be nice to have another pair of hands around, especially young hands that don't ache every time the weather changes. Lydia laughed. You're not that old. Old enough to know I can't do everything myself anymore. The construction began in early December, during a stretch of unseasonably warm weather that felt like a gift from Providence. The neighbors arrived with tools and materials, their wagons loaded with lumber and nails and rolls of tar paper. Daniel Whitmore proved to be a quick learner and a hard worker, his city softness giving way to calluses and competence within days. But the real surprise was Mara. She threw herself into the project with a passion that astonished everyone. She learned to measure and cut, to frame and nail, to read plans and solve problems. She worked alongside the men as an equal, never asking for quarter and never accepting any. By the second week, Jim Patterson was asking her advice on joint construction, and Tom Wheeler had declared her the best apprentice he'd ever seen. She's something else, that one, Jim said to Gideon one evening as they watched Mara correct Daniel's hammer technique with the patience of a seasoned teacher. Most girls her age are thinking about ribbons and dresses. She's thinking about load-bearing walls. Gideon smiled. She's been through more than most girls her age. It changes a person. I suppose it does. Jim shook his head in admiration. You've got yourself a fine family, Gideon. A fine family indeed. The addition was finished by Christmas. It wasn't perfect. The walls weren't quite level, some of the joints were visible, and one of the windows didn't close properly. But it was theirs. They had built it together, with their own hands and their own sweat and their own determination, and that made it more valuable than any professionally constructed mansion. The girls moved into their new rooms on Christmas Eve. June's room was closest to the barn, so she could hear the animals at night. Ellie's room had the window overlooking the pasture, just as she had requested, with shelves for her ever-growing collection of dolls. And Mara's room was at the corner, with windows on 2 walls that let in the morning light and gave her a view of both the mountains and the valley below. It's beautiful, Mara said softly, standing in the center of her new space. I've never had my own room before. Not really. You deserve it, Gideon said. You deserve a place that's all yours. Mara turned to face him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for saving us, for taking us in, for... She gestured around the room, unable to find words for what she was feeling. For this. Gideon put a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to thank me. You're my daughter. This is what fathers do. It was the first time he had said it so directly. Not Papa Gideon, not a father figure, but my daughter. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Mara's composure cracked. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his chest the way she had on that first terrible morning when Silas had come to take them away. I love you, Papa, she whispered. I love you so much. Gideon held her tight, his own tears falling into her dark hair. I love you too, Mara. I love you too.
The new year brought new challenges and new opportunities.
The ranch continued to grow, the herd expanding, the fields yielding more each season. Gideon hired 2 hands to help with the work, young men from town who needed employment and were willing to learn. He paid them fairly and treated them well, and in return they gave him loyalty and labor that made the operation run smoother than ever. But it wasn't just the ranch that was growing. In February, Lydia told him she was pregnant. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold when she took his hand and placed it on her belly. "There's something I need to tell you," she said softly. Gideon looked at her, confused. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby." For a moment he couldn't speak. His hand trembled against her stomach, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "A baby," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "A baby." Lydia's eyes were shining with tears and joy. "I wasn't sure at first. I thought maybe I was imagining it, hoping for something that couldn't be. But I saw the doctor last week when I went to town for supplies. He confirmed it." Gideon stared at her, his mind reeling. A baby. His baby. Their baby. A new life created from their love, growing inside the woman he had come to treasure more than his own existence. "Are you happy?" Lydia asked, her voice uncertain. "I know we never talked about this. I know you already lost children once, and maybe you don't want—" He silenced her with a kiss. "I'm happy," he said when they finally pulled apart. "I'm terrified and overwhelmed, and I have no idea how we're going to manage. But I'm happy. So incredibly, impossibly happy." Lydia laughed, tears streaming down her face. "I was afraid you'd be scared, that you wouldn't want to go through it again." "I am scared," he admitted, "but I've learned something this past year. The things worth having are the things worth being scared for. Love, family, new life." He pressed his forehead against hers. "I lost everything once, and I thought my life was over. But it wasn't. It was just waiting for you, waiting for the girls, waiting for this." "Waiting for hope," Lydia whispered. "Waiting for hope." They told the girls that evening, gathered around the dinner table in their newly expanded home. The reactions were immediate and overwhelming. Ellie shrieked with joy and immediately began planning everything she would teach the baby, from horseback riding to doll names to the proper way to feed chickens. June burst into tears, happy tears, she insisted, and started mentally cataloging everything she would need to learn about infant care. And Mara, predictably, asked the practical questions. When was the baby due? Did they have enough supplies? Would they need to build another room? "September," Lydia answered. "The doctor says September, and yes, we might need another room eventually, but we have time to figure that out." "I can help build it," Mara said immediately. "I know how now." "I know you do." Gideon smiled at her. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, let's just be happy about the news." "I am happy," Mara said, and then softly, "I'm going to be a big sister again. A real big sister." "You're already a real big sister," June pointed out, "to me and Ellie." "I know. But this is different. This is—" Mara struggled to find the words. "This is starting over, making something new, not just surviving what happened before, but creating something that wouldn't have existed without all of us being together." It was a surprisingly profound observation for a 13-year-old, and it silenced the table for a moment. "You're right," Lydia finally said. "This baby is something new, something that belongs to all of us, a symbol of the family we've become." "A Ward baby," Ellie declared. "The first real Ward baby." "The first of this generation," Gideon corrected gently. "But not the only one. Someday you girls will grow up and have families of your own, and those children will be Wards too, in their hearts, if not in name." "I'm never getting married," Mara announced. "Me neither," June agreed. "I'm going to marry Solomon," Ellie said confidently. The table erupted in laughter, breaking the solemnity of the moment and replacing it with warmth and joy. They finished dinner in high spirits, talking and planning and dreaming of the future. And that night, as Gideon lay in bed beside Lydia, his hand resting on the slight curve of her belly, he allowed himself to imagine what that future might look like. He saw the baby growing up on the ranch, learning to ride and rope and plant and harvest. He saw Mara as a young woman, strong and capable, perhaps running a spread of her own someday. He saw June as a veterinarian or a farmer, surrounded by the animals she loved. He saw Ellie as Ellie, a force of nature that would probably take over the world if given half a chance. He saw Christmases and birthdays, weddings and celebrations. He saw grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a legacy that stretched out across the years like a river flowing toward the sea. He saw a future. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, that future didn't frighten him. It filled him with hope. Spring arrived in a riot of color and sound. The fields burst into bloom, the animals emerged from their winter torpor, and the whole world seemed to wake up and stretch after a long sleep. Gideon threw himself into the work of the season, plowing and planting and preparing for another year of growth. But his attention kept drifting to Lydia. Her pregnancy was progressing well, the doctor assured them, but Gideon couldn't help worrying. He remembered Sarah's pregnancies, the fatigue, the discomfort, the constant anxiety about what could go wrong. He found himself watching Lydia more closely than ever, noting every wince, every sigh, every moment of rest. "You're hovering," Lydia told him one afternoon, catching him staring at her from across the yard. "Again." "I'm not hovering. I'm observing." "You're hovering." But she was smiling. "I'm fine, Gideon. The baby's fine. You need to stop worrying so much." "I can't help it." He crossed to her side, taking her hands in his. "You're carrying my child. Our child. If anything happened to you..." "Nothing's going to happen to me." She squeezed his hands. "I've done this 3 times before, remember? I know what I'm doing." "I know, but..." "No buts." She silenced him with a kiss. "Trust me. Trust the baby. Trust that after everything we've been through, the universe isn't going to be cruel enough to take this away from us." Gideon wanted to argue that the universe had been plenty cruel before, had taken his wife, his sons, had nearly destroyed him. But he also knew that Lydia was right. They had been given a second chance, both of them, and second chances weren't meant to be wasted on fear. "All right," he said finally, "I'll try to stop hovering. That's all I ask." But of course, he couldn't stop completely. He was too invested, too aware of how fragile happiness could be. He just learned to hide it better. The summer passed quickly, measured in growing crops and swelling bellies. Lydia bloomed along with the garden, her skin glowing, her spirits high. The girls doted on her, fetching and carrying, making sure she never had to lift a finger if they could help it. Even Mara, who had initially been hesitant about the pregnancy, had become fiercely protective, glaring at anyone who so much as suggested that Lydia should exert herself. "She's going to be a wonderful aunt," Lydia observed one evening, watching Mara lecture Daniel Whitmore about proper nutrition for expectant mothers. "Or maybe a mother herself someday, despite what she says now." "She's already a mother in some ways," Gideon said. "She helped raise June and Ellie when you couldn't. She took on responsibilities that no child should have to bear." "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for putting her in that position." "You didn't have a choice. You were surviving, and so was she." Gideon put his arm around her. "But that's over now. She gets to be a child again, or at least a teenager, with all the drama that entails." As if on cue, Mara's voice drifted across the yard. "I don't care what the book says, Daniel. Any fool can see that pregnant women need more protein, not less." Lydia laughed. "Well, she's certainly got opinions. She comes by it honestly." September arrived with cool nights and crisp mornings, the first hints of autumn painting the edges of the leaves. The baby was due any day now, and the entire household had shifted into a state of barely contained anticipation. Gideon had sent word to the Whitmores, who arrived a week before the due date, determined not to miss the birth of their honorary grandchild. The doctor had been put on notice, ready to ride out at a moment's call. And the girls had prepared everything they could think of, blankets and clothing and a cradle that Mara had built herself, with only minimal help from Jim Patterson. The waiting was the hardest part. Lydia paced the cabin like a caged animal, too uncomfortable to sit still, but too tired to do anything productive. The girls hovered around her, driving her crazy with their solicitousness. And Gideon found himself counting the minutes, starting at every sound, convinced that each moment would be the one. The moment finally came on a cool September evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Lydia had been sitting on the porch, watching the light fade, when she suddenly gasped and gripped the arm of her chair. "Gideon," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "It's time." What followed was a blur of activity. Gideon sent one of the ranch hands racing to fetch the doctor. Edith Whitmore took charge, shooing everyone out of the bedroom and preparing for the delivery with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The girls were relegated to the sitting room, where they huddled together in anxious silence. The labor lasted through the night. Gideon sat on the porch, unable to stay inside, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but wait and pray and hope. He thought about Sarah, about the births of Thomas and Samuel. He thought about the joy of those moments and the agony of losing them. He thought about everything he had been through to reach this point: the grief, the isolation, the desperate knock on his door that had changed everything. Please, he prayed to whatever power might be listening, please let them be all right. Please let me keep them. The sun was just beginning to rise when he heard it. A baby's cry, strong and healthy and impossibly loud, piercing the dawn like a trumpet, announcing the arrival of a new soul into the world. Gideon was on his feet and running before he even realized he had moved. He burst through the cabin door, past the startled girls, and into the bedroom where Lydia lay exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle in her arms. "Come meet your son," she whispered. Gideon crossed the room on trembling legs. He looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and beautiful beyond words. The baby had stopped crying and was blinking up at him with unfocused eyes that would someday be blue or brown or green. He couldn't tell yet. He had a tuft of dark hair on his head and the tiniest fingers Gideon had ever seen. "A boy," he breathed. "A boy." Lydia smiled through her tears. "I thought we might call him Nathan, after my first husband, if that's all right with you." Gideon's throat tightened. "Nathan Ward. Nathan Ward." "A name that honors the past and belongs to the future." "It's perfect." Gideon reached out and touched the baby's cheek, marveling at the softness of his skin. "He's perfect." The bedroom door burst open, and 3 faces appeared: Mara, June, and Ellie, unable to wait any longer. "Is it here? Is the baby here? Can we see?" Ellie was practically vibrating with excitement. Lydia laughed. "Come in, all of you. Come meet your brother." The girls crowded around the bed, their eyes wide with wonder. Ellie immediately reached out to touch the baby's hand, giggling when his tiny fingers closed around hers. "He's so small," she exclaimed. "Was I this small when I was born?" "Smaller," Lydia assured her. "He's beautiful," June whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Even Mara, usually so guarded, couldn't hide her emotion. She stared at the baby with an expression of pure, unadulterated love. "Nathan," she said softly. "Welcome to the family, little brother." The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy. Baby Nathan proved to be a demanding infant, hungry at all hours and possessed of a set of lungs that could wake the dead. But no one complained. Every cry, every feeding, every dirty diaper was a reminder that he was here, alive, theirs. The girls took to their roles as big sisters with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Ellie wanted to hold the baby constantly and had to be gently reminded that he needed to eat and sleep sometimes. June appointed herself the baby's primary caretaker, keeping detailed records of his feeding schedule and diaper changes. And Mara, despite her initial reluctance, proved to be a natural, calm and competent, always knowing exactly what to do when the baby fussed or cried. "You're good at this," Gideon told her one evening, watching her rock Nathan to sleep with practiced ease. Mara shrugged. "I had practice with Ellie. She was a fussy baby too." "That's not what I meant." Gideon sat down beside her. "I meant that you have a gift, a way of making people feel safe. I've seen it with your sisters, and now I see it with Nathan." Mara was quiet for a moment. "I learned it from necessity," she finally said. "When we were running from Silas, when Mama was barely holding it together, someone had to be the calm one. Someone had to make the little ones feel like everything was going to be all right, even when it wasn't. That's a heavy burden for a child to carry." It was. She looked down at Nathan sleeping peacefully in her arms. "But it's different now. Now I do it because I want to, not because I have to, and that makes all the difference. Gideon reached over and squeezed her shoulder. You're an amazing young woman, Mara. Your father, both your fathers, would be incredibly proud of you. Mara's eyes glistened. Thank you, Papa. Thank you. For everything you've done for this family, for everything you continue to do. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the baby sleep, feeling the peace of a home that was whole and complete. The first Thanksgiving with Nathan was a celebration unlike any other. The cabin, newly expanded, warm and welcoming, was filled with people and laughter and the smell of roasting turkey. The Whitmores had come, of course, along with neighbors and friends from town. The table, extended with boards and sawhorses to accommodate everyone, groaned under the weight of food. And at the head of the table sat Gideon Ward, surrounded by his family. Lydia beside him, glowing with happiness, Nathan cradled in her arms. Mara on his other side, almost 14 now, tall and confident and beautiful. June across the table, her journal open beside her plate, already recording the details of the day. And Ellie, bouncing in her seat, unable to contain her excitement. Can we say what we're thankful for? Ellie asked, just as she had 2 years ago. Please. Gideon smiled. Of course we can. Who wants to go first? Me? Ellie's hand shot up. I'm thankful for baby Nathan because he's the cutest baby in the whole world, and he grabbed my finger yesterday, and I think that means he loves me best. And I'm thankful for Solomon because he let me ride him all by myself last week. And I'm thankful for cake because I can smell it, and I know there's going to be cake later. Everyone laughed. June went next, her voice soft but clear. I'm thankful for my family, for my sisters and my brother and my mama and papa. I'm thankful that we're all together and that we're safe and that we have enough food to eat and a warm place to sleep. I know that's a lot of things, but I'm thankful for all of them. Mara took a moment to collect her thoughts before speaking. I'm thankful for second chances, she said finally. 2 years ago, I didn't believe in them. I thought that once something was lost, it was lost forever. But I was wrong. People can start over. Families can be rebuilt. Hearts can heal. She looked at Gideon, her eyes bright. I'm thankful that you opened your door that night. I'm thankful that you chose us. Lydia was crying when she spoke. I'm thankful for love, she said simply. Love that survives loss. Love that grows from ashes. Love that creates new life. She looked down at the baby in her arms. I'm thankful for every moment of every day with all of you. All eyes turned to Gideon. He sat quietly for a moment, looking around the table at the faces of the people he loved. His wife, his daughters, his son. His friends and neighbors and extended family gathered together to celebrate another year of blessings. 3 years ago, he began, his voice rough with emotion, I thought my life was over. I had lost everything. My wife, my sons, my reason for living. I existed in darkness, convinced that I would never see light again. He paused, gathering himself. Then a woman knocked on my door. She was exhausted and desperate, with 3 starving children clinging to her skirts. She asked for help. And something inside me, something I thought had died, woke up. His eyes found Lydia's. I didn't save them. They saved me. Every day since that night, they have saved me again and again. They have taught me that love doesn't end when we lose someone. It just waits. Waits for us to be ready to love again. He looked at each of the girls in turn. Mara, you taught me that strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. June, you taught me that gentleness is a kind of power, that caring for small things is what makes big things possible. Ellie, you taught me that joy is a choice, that we can find light even in the darkest places. He looked at Lydia again, then down at the baby in her arms. And now we have Nathan, a new life, a new beginning, a symbol of everything we've built together, everything we've survived, everything we've become. He raised his glass. I'm thankful for all of you, for this family, for this home, for the chance to love again, to live again, to hope again. His voice cracked. I'm thankful that I didn't die in that darkness. I'm thankful that I held on long enough to find the light. The table was silent for a moment. Then Ellie raised her glass of apple cider. To us, she declared. To the Ward family. To the Ward family, so everyone echoed, glasses clinking around the table. And in that moment, surrounded by love and laughter and warmth, Gideon Ward felt something he had almost forgotten existed. He felt complete. The years that followed were kind to the Ward family. The ranch prospered, growing from a modest homestead into one of the most successful operations in the valley. Gideon expanded the herd, improved the fields, and built a reputation for fairness and quality that brought buyers from hundreds of miles away. The girls grew up, each finding her own path in the world. Mara, true to her word, never married. But she didn't need to. She took over the day-to-day management of the ranch, becoming the best rancher in 3 counties, respected by men twice her age. She was tough and fair, with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, and no one who worked for her ever forgot that they were working for a Ward. June did marry, eventually. A quiet veterinarian from Denver who shared her love of animals and her gentle spirit. They settled on a piece of land adjacent to the ranch, close enough for daily visits, and filled their home with dogs and cats and rescued creatures of every description. And Ellie, against all predictions, did not marry Solomon the horse. She married a lawyer named William Hartley, a city man who fell in love with her at a dance and never recovered. They moved to Denver, where Ellie became a society matron who threw legendary parties and championed every charitable cause she could find. But she came home to the ranch every holiday, usually with a tribe of children in tow, filling the cabin with noise and chaos and joy. Nathan grew up surrounded by sisters who adored him and parents who loved him beyond measure. He had Gideon's quiet strength and Lydia's warm heart, and he became the kind of man that both his fathers, the one who raised him and the one whose name he bore, would have been proud of. And Gideon and Lydia, the 2 broken souls who had found each other in the darkness, grew old together on the ranch they had built. They watched the seasons change year after year from their porch overlooking the valley. They watched their children grow up and start families of their own. They watched grandchildren and great-grandchildren run through the fields where cattle had once grazed, filling the air with laughter and light. And every Thanksgiving, they gathered the family together, however large it had grown, and gave thanks for the blessings they had received. On a warm evening in late September, many years after that first desperate knock on the door, Gideon sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. He was old now, his hair white, his hands gnarled, his body worn by decades of hard work. But his eyes were still sharp, and his heart was still full. Lydia sat beside him, as she had every evening for as long as either of them could remember. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with age, but to Gideon, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever known. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft. "Everything. Nothing." He reached over and took her hand. "How lucky we've been." "We have been lucky." She squeezed his fingers. "Beyond anything I ever dared to hope for. Do you remember that first night when you knocked on my door?" Lydia laughed. "How could I forget? I was terrified, exhausted, convinced that whoever lived in this cabin would turn us away." "I almost did." Gideon shook his head at the memory. "I almost closed the door and walked away. I'd gotten so good at shutting people out." "But you didn't." "No, I didn't, because of Ellie." "Because of Ellie?" She looked at me with those big blue eyes and she asked if I could help her mama, and something inside me broke, or maybe healed. I'm not sure there's a difference. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors deepen across the sky. "I've been thinking about Sarah lately," Gideon said finally, "and Thomas and Samuel, wondering what they would have thought of all this." "I think they would have approved," Lydia said gently. "I think they would have been happy that you found love again, that you didn't spend the rest of your life alone in this cabin, drowning in grief." "I hope so. I've never stopped loving them, you know, never stopped missing them." "I know, and I've never asked you to." Lydia rested her head on his shoulder. "There's room in a heart for more than one love. The new doesn't erase the old, it just adds to it." Gideon pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "When did you get so wise?" "I've had a good teacher." They watched the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and gold. In the distance, they could hear laughter.
grandchildren playing in the yard, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. No regrets? Lydia asked. Gideon considered the question. He thought about everything he had lost and everything he had gained. He thought about the darkness and the light, the grief and the joy, the endings and the beginnings. Not a single one, he said finally. Not a single one. Lydia smiled and settled more comfortably against his side. They sat there together, the two of them, as the stars came out one by one. The cabin behind them was warm and full, echoing with the sounds of family. The ranch around them was peaceful and prosperous, a testament to decades of hard work and love. And in the quiet of the evening, with his wife beside him and his family nearby, Gideon Ward finally understood what he had been searching for all those years ago in the depths of his grief and despair. Not an ending, a beginning. It had started with a knock on a door, a desperate woman, 3 starving children, a choice to help when it would have been so much easier to turn away. And from that single moment of compassion, an entire life had grown. I love you, he said softly. I love you too, Lydia replied. Forever and ever. Forever and ever. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, eternal and unchanging. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of harvest. And in the cabin in the valley, the Ward family laughed and talked and loved, bound together by something stronger than blood, something more enduring than time. A family reborn, a love reclaimed, a life worth living. As Gideon closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of his family, he felt a peace settle over him that he had never known before. The ghosts of his past were still with him. They would always be with him. But they no longer haunted him. They blessed him. They reminded him of what he had lost and what he had found, of the fragility of happiness and the resilience of hope. He hadn't saved them, that desperate family who had appeared on his doorstep so many years ago. They had saved him. And in saving each other, they had created something beautiful, something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward by the children and grandchildren who would inherit not just their land, but their story. The story of a knock on a door, the story of a choice, the story of a family reborn. Gideon smiled and held his wife's hand a little tighter, and the stars shone down on them all. The end.